Hey, you made it. You found your way here to this quiet little corner of the internet at whatever hour this happens to be for you. Maybe you're already tucked under your blanket. Maybe the lights are low and the day finally feels like it is loosening its grip. Whatever tonight looks like for you, I am really glad you are here. Now, before we begin, I want to ask you something. Imagine you woke up one morning, looked in the mirror and decided that to be beautiful that day, truly acceptably beautiful by the standards of your world, you would need to spread actual lead across your face. Not metaphorically, real lead, ground into a fine white powder and mixed with vinegar. And then you would smooth it across your cheeks, your forehead, your neck carefully the way we now apply moisturizer, knowing somewhere in the back of your mind that it was slowly poisoning you. And here is the strangest part. You would do it anyway. Because everyone around you was doing the same thing. Because pale skin meant you were not a peasant baking in the fields. Because pale skin meant power. Pale skin meant you mattered. That is where tonight's story begins, not with vanity, but with something far more human. Fear, aspiration. The desperate, beautiful, sometimes heartbreaking things women have done across centuries just to be seen. If this is the kind of story that makes your evenings feel a little richer, a little more interesting, I would love it if you would take a quiet moment right now, before you drift too deep into the story, to subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. And if something tonight genuinely moves you or surprises you, drop a comment below, even just a single word. It means more than you know, and it truly helps this little channel keep going. I always love hearing where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are in the world right now. Now dim the lights just a little more if you can. Let the room get soft, and let us go back a very long time to a world where beauty had a price far higher than anything you would ever find on a store shelf today. We need to go to Rome first. Ancient Rome, the 1st century of the Common Era, a city of about 1 million people, marble columns, public baths, and an absolute obsession with appearance. Roman women of the upper classes took their beauty routines seriously, in a way that would honestly impress a modern-day influencer. They had foundation, they had blush, they had eyeshadow and lip colour and something that functioned as eyeliner. But here is what made Roman beauty both fascinating and quietly horrifying. So many of those products were made from substances we now know to be toxic, at levels that would shut down a modern cosmetics company overnight. Chalk and white lead, called cerussa in Latin, were the foundation of the Roman ideal complexion. Women would grind lead carbonate into a fine powder, mix it with animal fat or water, and apply it to their skin to achieve the paleness that Roman society associated with feminine refinement, leisure, and good breeding. The Roman poet Ovid, writing around the year 2 in the Common Era, actually addressed this directly in his work, Medicamina Faciae Feminae, which translates to cosmetics for the female face. He both advised women on their beauty routines and gently poetically warned them that beauty required effort and care. What he did not fully warn them about, because no one yet understood it, was that the lead in their foundation was accumulating in their bodies with every single application. Lead poisoning does not announce itself dramatically. It is slow and quiet and deceptive. It begins with fatigue, with headaches, with a subtle dulling of the senses. Over months and years it damages the nervous system, the kidneys, the blood. It causes hair loss. It causes the skin to eventually become, and this is almost unbearably ironic, grey and dull. The very thing women were using to look more beautiful was over time making them look far worse, which led them to apply more of it, which accelerated the damage. It was a loop with no clean exit, and Rome was just the beginning. Let us move forward about 1500 years forward, through the fall of empires, through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, and into the court of Queen Elizabeth I of England. If you know one image of Elizabeth, the great red-haired commanding queen who ruled England from 1558 to 1603, you probably know the image of her face. White. Almost unnaturally, startlingly white. Her portraits show a woman whose complexion is the colour of paper, of porcelain of fresh snow, and that was entirely intentional. Elizabeth I was arguably the most famous user of ceruse, the same white lead mixture the Romans had used, now refined, perfumed and sold in small pots across London. Elizabeth's ceruse was typically a mixture of white lead and vinegar, sometimes called spirits of lead, blended into a paste and applied thickly across the face and neck. Over it she would sometimes apply a wash of egg white to create a smooth-sealed finish that gave her skin a luminous, almost lacquered appearance in candlelight. She was not unusual in this. The Elizabethan court was full of women and men doing the same thing. Pale skin was not just fashionable in 16th century England. It was a visual argument. It said, I do not work outdoors. I do not labour in the sun. I am educated, refined and wealthy. My skin has never seen a field. For women in particular, pale skin was also linked in a way that seems almost poignant now to purity, to virtue, to a kind of moral cleanliness. Darkness suggested wildness, foreignness, the outdoors. Paleness suggested the indoors, the domestic, the controlled. And so women paid for that whiteness sometimes with their lives. One of the most documented cases involves the Countess of Coventry Maria Gunning, a celebrated Irish beauty of the 1700s, who was considered one of the most beautiful women in all of England. She was so famous for her looks that people would climb on chairs and crowd into rooms just to catch a glimpse of her face. She died in 1760 at the age of 27. The cause widely reported at the time was her heavy use of ceruse and other lead-based cosmetics. She had apparently applied them so frequently and so liberally that her health had been collapsing for years. Her skin by the end reportedly had a greyish damaged quality that she tried to cover with more lead-based foundation. She was not the only one. Historians believe that chronic low-level lead poisoning from cosmetics contributed to the early deaths of a significant number of upper-class European women during this period. We do not have a precise number because no one at the time was connecting the dots in the way a modern doctor would. They knew something was off. Physicians of the era wrote vaguely about cosmetics being injurious to health, but the link was fuzzy and the desire for pale skin was absolute. Here is what I find deeply, almost painfully human about this. These were not foolish women. They were not uninformed in any broader sense. Many of them were educated, politically sharp, socially skilled. Elizabeth I ran a country for 45 years with a shrewdness that still impresses historians today. But they existed inside a system, a set of standards, expectations, and visual codes that told them every single day that their worth was partly expressed through the paleness of their skin. And within that system, the choice to use ceruse was not irrational. It was actually quite logical. If pale skin meant power and you wanted access to power, then pale skin was worth a cost. The cost just happened to be far higher than anyone fully reckoned with. You might be thinking right now, well, we would never do anything like that today. We are far too informed, far too cautious. And I want to gently point out we still buy products we are warned about. We still follow beauty standards that cost us money, time, sometimes health. The specific rituals change, the underlying human dynamic remarkably consistent. Now let's take a brief turn toward the Victorian era, specifically the 1880s and 1890s, because this is where the story takes a turn that genuinely shocked me when I first researched it. By the Victorian period, white lead ceruse had begun to fall out of fashion, partly because awareness of its dangers had grown. Medical journals were writing about lead poisoning. Reformers were raising alarm bells. Enter arsenic. I know. You were expecting something safer, and instead here we are discussing the ingredient used in rat poison. Arsenic in the Victorian era became something of a beauty miracle drug, at least that is how it was marketed. Specifically, a product called Fowler's Solution, developed in 1786 by the English physician Dr. Thomas Fowler, was a liquid containing potassium arsenite. It was originally intended as a medicine, a treatment for fevers, for skin conditions, for a range of ailments. But women discovered something interesting in small doses. Arsenic gave the skin a luminous, rosy, almost translucent quality. It slightly dilated the blood vessels near the surface of the skin, creating a delicate flush. It also suppressed certain kinds of acne. In a culture that was beginning to shift away from the deathly white Elizabethan ideal and towards something slightly more naturally rosy and healthy-looking arsenic delivered precisely what was wanted. By the 1880s, there were actual over-the-counter products sold openly in pharmacies advertised in ladies' magazines that contained arsenic for beauty purposes. One of the most famous was a product called Dr. James P. Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion Wafers. The name is extraordinary when you sit with it for a moment. Safe arsenic. It is almost comedic, except that women were genuinely taking these tablets daily, accumulating arsenic in their bodies, chasing a complexion ideal that required in effect slow self-poisoning. The arsenic-eating women of Styria, a region of what is now Austria, became a genuine documented phenomenon in the 1860s and 1870s. Local women in this mountain region had long consumed arsenic as a folk practice, believing it improved their complexion, their energy, their general appearance. Several British and American writers travelled there specifically to investigate and report on these women who were described as having unusually clear rosy skin and striking physical vitality. Dr. Johann Lorenz Böck documented the practice in Austrian medical literature, noting that the women began in small doses and built up a tolerance over time. The fact that tolerance was possible, that the body could adapt to low doses without immediate death, made it seem safe, even beneficial. It was not, of course, safe in any long-term sense, but in a world without modern toxicology, without randomized controlled trials, without a century of accumulated medical research, how would you know? What strikes me about all of this, the arsenic, the elaborate and painstaking rituals of women across these centuries, is not the toxicity itself. It is the desire beneath the toxicity. These women were not chasing beauty for vanity in the shallow, dismissive sense we sometimes use that word. They were navigating a world in which their appearance was one of the very few levers of social power they actually held. They could not vote. They could not own property in most circumstances. They could not hold political office or run a business in their own name. But they could be seen as beautiful. They could be seen as refined, as elevated, as belonging to the right class, the right category, the right level of civilization as their society defined it. And in that context, the white face, whether achieved through lead or arsenic or any other substance, was not decoration. It was armor. It was a credential. It was a language that their entire culture had agreed to speak, and they were simply speaking it as fluently as they possibly could. The cost was real. The harm was real. But so was the world that made those choices feel necessary. One more detail before we gently move forward tonight, because I think it is the most quietly devastating one. Elizabeth I, who'd been applying Ceres to her face for most of her adult life, developed in her later years a deep aversion to mirrors. She reportedly ordered that mirrors be removed from rooms she occupied. Whether this was purely about aging, she was in her 60s and 70s by the end of her reign, an old woman by the standards of her time, or whether it was also about what the lead-based cosmetics had done to her skin. Over decades, we cannot say for certain. But there is something in that image, this enormously powerful woman who had ruled the most significant empire of her era, who had outmaneuvered some of the cleverest men in European politics, quietly turning away from her own reflection, that makes me feel something I am still not entirely sure I have words for. She had paid the price of her era's beauty standard, and at the end she did not want to see the bill. Now, the white face was only the beginning of what women across history were willing to do in the name of beauty, and it only gets stranger and more fascinating from here. Because while women were spreading lead across their cheeks in London, something entirely different was happening in the ballrooms of Paris, something involving towers of hair tall enough to brush the chandeliers, and a very real risk of catching fire mid-conversation at a dinner party. That is exactly where we are headed next. So we left Elizabeth I standing alone in a room with no mirrors, and honestly, given what comes next in the history of women and beauty, she may have been the wise one. Because if you think spreading lead on your face was a commitment, wait until you hear what women in the 1770s were doing to their hair. We're talking about structures so tall, they required a woman to kneel on the floor of her carriage just to fit through the door. Hairstyles that took 4 to 6 hours to build, sometimes longer, creations that could not be taken down for weeks at a time, and inside some of them, and I promise you this is documented, not invented, there were actual living mice. Let me take you there. Paris, 1772. The city is the centre of the European world in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate. What Paris wears, eats, thinks, and builds becomes within months what London, Vienna, Madrid, and St. Petersburg aspire to. French fashion is not merely fashion, it is a form of soft power cultural dominance expressed through silk and powder and the architecture of the human body. And at the apex of that world sits a young woman who has just arrived from Vienna, aged 16, nervous, extraordinary, and about to become the most watched and imitated woman on the continent, Marie Antoinette. She did not invent the towering hairstyle that would become her signature, but she elevated it quite literally into something that had never quite existed before. And the story of how it happened and what it cost the women who followed her is one of the stranger and more quietly absurd chapters in the history of beauty. To understand the hair, you first need to understand the man behind it. His name was Léonard Autier, known simply as Léonard, and he was Marie Antoinette's personal hairdresser, beginning their working relationship around 1774, when she became Queen of France at the age of 18. Léonard was not merely a craftsman, he was an artist, an architect, a theatrical designer who happened to work in human hair. He took what had already been a trend toward tall powdered hairstyles, a style called the pouf, and pushed it into a realm that was by any reasonable measure completely unhinged. A fully realized pouf of the 1770s could reach 12 to 18 inches above the top of a woman's head. Some of the most extreme examples, documented in contemporary illustrations and satirical prints, reached heights of 24 inches or more. That is 2 full feet of hair padding, wireframe, false hair pieces, and whatever decorative objects had been requested that week, and the requests were genuinely remarkable. One of the most famous poufs created by Léonard for Marie Antoinette depicted a naval battle. A miniature model of the French warship La Belle Poule, which had recently defeated a British frigate in 1778, was recreated in miniature and placed atop the Queen's hair, surrounded by billowing silk waves and tiny cannons. Women at Versailles commissioned poufs depicting gardens, pastoral scenes, bird cages with real birds, and in at least one documented case a working miniature windmill. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A working miniature windmill on top of someone's head at a formal dinner. Somewhere right now your morning hair routine is looking extremely manageable by comparison. But here is where the story moves from delightful absurdity into something more interesting, because the mechanics of maintaining these hairstyles reveal a great deal about the lives of the women who wore them. The base structure of a towering pouf was built on a wire or horsehair frame called a cushion, sometimes stuffed with wool cotton or even rags which was pinned to the woman's own hair. Over and around this frame the hairdresser would arrange and pin false hairpieces, curls and braids, holding everything together with a substance called pomade. Now, pomade in the 18th century was not the sleek petroleum-based product you might be imagining. It was most commonly rendered animal fat lard sheep tallow, sometimes bear grease mixed with fragrant ingredients like orange flower water or lavender to mask the smell of the fat itself. This pomade was applied generously to hold the hair in place, and over it a fine dusting of powder, typically flour or starch, sometimes scented, was applied to create the fashionable matte white or grey finish. Let us think carefully about what this means in practical terms. You have a structure of human hair, false hair, animal fat and flour sitting on top of a woman's head sometimes for weeks without being taken down, in warm rooms, near candles, in the summer heat of a Versailles ballroom. The smell after even a few days was reportedly significant. Perfume and 18th century women used a great deal of it could only do so much. Contemporary accounts mention women carrying long-handled scratching sticks, essentially elegant back scratchers for the scalp, because the itching as the pomade aged and the hair went unwashed became genuinely difficult to endure. And then there were the mice. This is perhaps the detail that made you pause earlier, and I want to give it the careful treatment it deserves, because it lives in a complicated space between documented historical record and enthusiastically embellished urban legend. What we know for certain, the combination of flour-based powder and animal fat pomade created an environment that was genuinely attractive to rodents. Contemporary diarists and satirists in the 1770s and 1780s made repeated references to mice nesting in women's hair, and the sheer volume and consistency of these references suggests that whatever the literal truth, the problem was real enough to enter the cultural imagination as a genuine fear. The Scottish writer and traveller Tobias Smollett, writing in the 1760s and 70s, described the state of French women's hair with unconcealed horror. Several British satirical magazines published cartoons showing mice scurrying through poufs while their oblivious owners conversed at dinner parties. Whether mice actually nested in living women's hairstyles regularly or occasionally, or only in the most extreme cases of neglect, that remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the risk was considered real enough by the women themselves that some slept in special high-framed beds, designed to keep their heads elevated away from any surface, and that certain accounts describe women sleeping sitting upright in chairs rather than risk disturbing or infesting their hair on a pillow. Can you imagine sitting upright in a chair, all night, for weeks, because your hairstyle is structurally too significant to risk laying down? I genuinely do not know whether to find this funny or to feel a deep and heartfelt sympathy. I think perhaps both. Now I want to ask you something, because I find this genuinely thought-provoking. When you look at this, the hours of construction, the discomfort, the mice, the itching, the sleeping upright, the easy response is to think, how could any woman submit to this? But here is the more interesting question: what was she getting in return? Because these women were not suffering passively. They were making a calculated exchange in the same way humans in every era make calculated exchanges around appearance and belonging. In the world of Versailles and the aristocratic courts of Europe, visibility was power. To be noticed, genuinely, memorably noticed by the right people in the right rooms, was the difference between a good marriage and a brilliant one, between social obscurity and social influence, between a life with options and a life without them. The poof was not just a hairstyle, it was an announcement. It said, I have the resources to employ a skilled hairdresser. I have the time to sit for 4 hours while this is constructed. I have the social position to require this level of investment in my appearance. I belong here. And in a world where women's social and financial security depended almost entirely on marriage and court favour, in a world where the alternative to being seen as beautiful and refined was very often genuine hardship that announcement was worth sleeping upright for. The fire risk, by the way, was entirely real. Candles were everywhere in the 18th century and chandeliers on tables, on walls, in hands. And a tower of hair animal fat and powder, positioned 12 to 24 inches above a woman's head, placed that hair in uncomfortably close proximity to open flames at every social occasion. Contemporary accounts from the 1770s and 1780s describe multiple incidents of women's hairstyles catching fire at balls and dinner parties. The Countess of Mirepoix, a prominent figure at the French court, reportedly had her hair ignite at a Versailles event. Several London newspapers of the period documented similar incidents in English society. A London satirical magazine of 1776, commenting on the trend with the particular savage wit of British press of that era, suggested that fashionable ladies attending balls should carry fire buckets as accessories. They were joking, mostly. The danger was serious enough that some practical-minded women began wearing small wet sponges concealed somewhere in their hairstyle, available to be pressed against a flame quickly if needed. Others reportedly recruited servants to walk closely behind them at events watching for smoke, with the focused attention of a very well-dressed fire marshal. And then, almost as suddenly as it had risen, the tower came down. By the late 1780s, the political climate in France was shifting in ways that made elaborate aristocratic excess feel not merely unfashionable, but dangerous. The revolution was coming. The excess of Versailles was becoming something to resent rather than admire, to mock rather than imitate. Marie Antoinette herself simplified her hair dramatically in her later years, partly out of practical necessity, partly out of the kind of quiet adaptation that comes when the world around you is changing faster than you can follow. By the time she was imprisoned in 1792, her hair had gone fully white. Whether from grief stress or the natural course of time, accounts differ, and she reportedly wore it simply close to her head. The woman who had inspired a generation of women to build towers on their heads ended her life with no hair left to speak of. There is something in that arc from the naval battle poof to the prison cell that feels like a story about far more than hairstyles. But here is what stays with me after all the absurdity and the fire risks and the mice. The women who wore those towering poofs, most of them were not victims of fashion. They were participants. They were creative. The best of those hairstyles were genuinely extraordinary works of art. They were expressions of personality humour, political commentary and aesthetic ambition, in an era when women had very few other canvases available to them. The naval battle on Marie Antoinette's head was in its own completely unhinged way a political statement, a declaration of national pride, a piece of living theatre worn to dinner. Maybe that is not so different from the ways we use our appearance today to signal who we are, what we care about, which tribe we belong to. The scale has changed. The medium has changed, the impulse remarkably stubbornly human. We have travelled through lead powder and towering hair tonight, and in both cases the story underneath has been the same women navigating a world that gave them limited options, and finding extraordinary, sometimes dangerous, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes darkly funny ways to work within it. But we have not yet touched on something that ran beneath all of these rituals, beneath the white face and the powder and the pomade, something so fundamental to daily life that we barely think about it today, yet something that shaped every single aspect of how historical women moved through the world: the question of how they smelled. And I do not mean that unkindly. I mean it as a genuine historical inquiry, because the way women across the medieval and early modern world managed scent, masked odour, and constructed something called cleanliness, without running water, without soap as we know it, without any of the infrastructure we take entirely for granted, is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood stories in the entire history of beauty. That is exactly where we are headed next. Close your eyes for just a moment, not to sleep yet. We still have stories to tell, but just to imagine something. Imagine walking into a grand medieval cathedral. Stone walls, high vaulted ceilings, the faint flicker of candlelight, and underneath all of it, underneath the incense, underneath the beeswax candles, underneath the smell of cold stone, something else, something human, something that no amount of rose water could entirely erase. Now imagine that this is simply Tuesday, that this is the ordinary smell of the ordinary world, that no one around you finds it remarkable because everyone around you is part of it, because the concept of daily bathing does not yet exist, because running water is not in your home or your neighbour's home or frankly in most homes within a 50-mile radius. This was the reality for most people in medieval and early modern Europe, and what women did within that reality, the creativity, the ingenuity, the sometimes extraordinary lengths they went to in order to smell beautiful, feel clean, and present themselves as refined human beings, is one of the most misunderstood and genuinely fascinating chapters in the entire history of beauty. Because here is what most people get wrong about historical hygiene. They assume it simply did not exist, that people were dirty and they knew they were dirty and they just lived with it. And that is not the story at all. The real story is so much more interesting than that. Let us begin with what the word clean actually meant in medieval Europe, because it did not mean what you think it means. In the medieval worldview, which was shaped profoundly by both Christian theology and ancient Greek medical theory, cleanliness was not primarily about water. Water, in fact, was considered by many physicians and scholars to be potentially dangerous, a substance that opened the pores of the skin and allowed disease, miasma, and spiritual corruption to enter the body. This was not superstition for the sake of superstition. It was a coherent theory internally logical within the medical understanding of the time. The dominant medical framework inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen held that the body was governed by 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that the balance of these humours was delicate. Hot baths, it was believed, opened the pores and disrupted that balance. Repeated immersion in water weakened the body's defences, and so cleanliness for most medieval Europeans was achieved not through water, but through linen. White linen undergarments, the shift for women, the shirt for men, were worn directly against the skin and changed regularly. The linen was understood to absorb the impurities of the body, drawing out sweat and oils in the way that water might otherwise wash them away. To change your linen was in the medieval understanding of the term to cleanse yourself. A woman who changed her linen shift daily was considered clean. A woman who did not was not. The historian George Vigorello, in his landmark 1987 work, Concepts of Cleanliness, traced this linen-centered understanding of hygiene across several centuries of European history, documenting how the visible whiteness of clean linen became a marker of respectability, social standing, and moral virtue. The whiter and more frequently changed your linen, the cleaner, and therefore the more admirable you were considered to be. Now here is something I find genuinely remarkable about this. Within a framework where linen was the primary tool of hygiene, the women who had access to large quantities of fine white linen, who could afford to change their undergarments daily, to have their linen laundered frequently, to own enough shifts to rotate through, were the women who were considered the most refined and the most clean. It was once again a class marker wearing the disguise of a hygiene standard, but linen alone, as you might imagine, could only do so much. And this is where the real artistry begins, because medieval and early modern women developed an extraordinarily sophisticated system of scent management that we have almost entirely forgotten about, and that honestly deserves a great deal more credit than it typically receives. The first and most important tool was rose water. Rose water produced by steam distilling rose petals, a technique that had been refined in the Islamic world as early as the 9th and 10th centuries and arrived in Europe through trade, and the Crusades was arguably the most versatile beauty product in the medieval and Renaissance world. Women used it to rinse their hands and faces. They added it to their bath water on the relatively rare occasions when bathing occurred. They sprinkled it on their clothing, their bed linens, their hair. They drank it in small quantities as a digestive aid and breath freshener. A well-kept medieval noblewoman would have rose water present in essentially every aspect of her daily routine. Records from the English royal household in the 14th century document substantial purchases of rose water for the private chambers of noble ladies. It was not a luxury item in those circles, it was an expected necessity. And alongside rose water, there was lavender. Dried lavender was tucked into clothing chests and bed linens to discourage insects and impart fragrance. It was strewn on floors along with rushes, mint and other fragrant herbs in a practice called strewing, where the crushing of these plants underfoot released their scents into the air of a room. Medieval households with any pretension to refinement maintained what was essentially a living air freshener built into the architecture of their daily lives. The combination of rosewater, lavender, mint and other herbs meant that a well-managed household of the medieval period could smell genuinely authentically pleasant in a way that was simply different from modern cleanliness rather than definitively inferior to it. Now, and this is the detail I most want you to remember tonight because it is the one that genuinely surprised me. Let us talk about the pomander. A pomander was a small perforated container made of gold, silver, ivory, or carved wood depending on the wealth of the owner, filled with a mixture of fragrant substances and worn on the body, usually suspended from a belt, a chatelaine or a necklace so that it rested somewhere near the chest or waist. The word comes from the French pomme d'ambre, meaning apple of amber, a reference to ambergris, which was one of the most prized and expensive ingredients that could be placed inside one. And the contents of a well-made pomander were remarkable. A recipe recorded in an English household manuscript from around 1500 called for ambergris musk, civet labdanum, benzoin storax, and rose petals all ground together and formed into a paste. Let me translate a few of those ingredients for you because the translation is important. Ambergris is a waxy substance produced in the intestine of sperm whales. Yes, whales, that after years of aging in the ocean, develops an extraordinarily complex, warm, slightly sweet scent that fixatives perfume for a remarkable length of time. In the medieval and Renaissance period, a piece of ambergris was worth more than its weight in gold. Musk came from the musk deer of Central Asia, a substance secreted by the male deer from a gland near its abdomen, with a deep animalic warm scent that was considered deeply attractive and was used as a base note in virtually every sophisticated perfume of the period. Civet was similarly derived from animals, specifically from a gland of the civet cat, producing a substance that smells in its concentrated form genuinely unpleasant, but when diluted becomes warm, smooth, and extraordinarily long-lasting. So the medieval and Renaissance woman who wore a fine pomander at her waist was in effect walking through the world wrapped in a cloud of whale intestine, deer glands, and cat secretions carefully blended into something that the people around her found deeply beautiful and sophisticated. I'm not sure whether to describe this as resourceful or alarming, and I suspect the honest answer is both. Do you ever stop to think about how much of what we consider beautiful or desirable is simply what we've been taught to associate with those qualities? Because here is the thing about musk and ambergris, they worked. They genuinely worked. The reason these ingredients survived in perfumery for centuries, the reason synthetic versions of both musk and ambergris are still used in high-end perfumes today, is that they have a quality that interacts with human body chemistry in a way that is genuinely, almost chemically compelling. The women who wore pomanders were not foolish. They were solving a real problem with the best available materials, and the solution they arrived at was sophisticated enough to influence perfumery for the next 500 years. Moving forward in time into the 16th and 17th centuries, the art of scent management became, if anything, more elaborate and more politically significant. Catherine de' Medici, who arrived in France from Florence in 1533 at the age of 14 to marry the future King Henry II, brought with her a Florentine perfumer named René le Florentin, known in France simply as René the Florentine. René established a perfume shop on the Pont au Change in Paris that became within years one of the most famous and visited establishments in the city. What made René famous, and what made him a figure of some controversy and considerable fear, was his expertise in creating perfumed gloves. Scented gloves were among the most fashionable accessories of 16th century Europe. Leather gloves treated with perfume, typically jasmine, rose violet, or musk, were gifts exchanged between royalty given as marks of favour, and worn by anyone with pretensions to elegance. The fragrance served both a practical purpose, masking the smell of the leather itself, which could be unpleasant, and a social one, identifying the wearer as someone of refinement and means. But René the Florentine's gloves had a reputation that went beyond mere elegance. The rumour circulating through French court society, with the persistence of rumours that attach themselves to powerful and foreign women, was that Catherine de' Medici and René had developed a method of impregnating gloves with poison alongside the perfume. That certain pairs of gloves worn by the right or wrong person could deliver a fatal substance through the skin over time. Whether this was literally true is a question historians have debated for centuries without resolution. What we know for certain is that René was genuinely skilled in both perfumery and pharmacology, that the line between perfumer and apothecary was extremely thin in the 16th century, and that Catherine de' Medici's political enemies found the poison glove story entirely credible and enthusiastically repeated it. What we also know is that the story tells us something real about how scent functioned in this period, not merely as a personal comfort or a social marker, but as an instrument of power, intimacy, and occasionally fear. A perfume carried in a glove was something that touched the skin, that was breathed in close, that existed in the intimate space between bodies. To control scent was in some meaningful sense to control proximity, and proximity in a world of royal courts and political manoeuvring was everything. By the 17th century, the city of Grasse in southern France had established itself as the perfume capital of the world, a position it still holds today. The reason was partly geographical. The surrounding hills were ideal for growing jasmine, rose lavender, and orange blossom, and the local leather tanning industry had created a ready market for the scented gloves that were fashionable across Europe. But it was also the result of an extraordinary concentration of human skill and knowledge, generations of perfumers refining techniques for extracting, preserving, and blending fragrance in ways that were passed down within families as closely guarded professional secrets. The women of grace, the wives and daughters of perfumers, many of whom worked in the industry themselves, lived surrounded by flowers and fragrance in a way that was by all accounts genuinely extraordinary. Contemporary travellers described arriving in Grasse and smelling the town before they could see it. The scent of jasmine and rose carried on the wind from fields that stretched up the hillsides in every direction. It is a detail that makes me think of everything we have discussed tonight in a slightly different light, that at the centre of this centuries-long story about women and scent and the management of odour in a world without running water, there was also this genuine beauty, real flowers on real hillsides, the smell of jasmine on a warm evening in southern France. The rituals were sometimes strange, sometimes dangerous, sometimes almost unbearably complicated. But underneath them all there was an authentic human desire not just to be tolerable, not just to be acceptable, but to smell the way a summer evening feels, to carry something beautiful on your skin through a world that was often difficult and dark. That impulse, I think, is the one that has survived cleanest across all the centuries. We have lost the pomanders and the strewing herbs and the rosewater rinses, but the desire underneath them to move through the world, leaving something pleasant in your wake that is as alive today as it ever was. We have spent time tonight with pale faces, towering hair, and the extraordinary art of smelling beautiful without a shower. And in all three of these stories, the thread running underneath has been this women working creatively, sometimes desperately, within the constraints of their world. But we've not yet looked at the eyes. And when we do, when we open the history of what women put on and around their eyes across the centuries, the story gets darker, more ancient and more scientifically strange than almost anything we have discussed so far. Because the history of eye makeup is a history of beetles, of deadly plants, of a mineral that kills bacteria, and a drug that dilates your pupils until the room goes soft at the edges, and women who knew, or should have known exactly what they were doing. That story is coming right up. There is a particular kind of beauty that stops a room. Not the quiet, gradual kind that you notice slowly over the course of an evening, but the immediate kind, the kind where someone walks through a door and something shifts in the air, and every pair of eyes in the room moves without the owners quite deciding to move them. For most of recorded human history, women understood that the fastest path to that kind of presence ran directly through the eyes, not the cheekbones, not the lips, the eyes, and what women were willing to put onto and around their eyes in order to achieve that effect across 5,000 years of human civilization is a story that involves ancient Egyptian chemistry, Italian Renaissance botany, crushed insects from the mountains of Mexico, and a substance so powerful that a single drop placed directly on the eyeball could make a woman temporarily blind in bright light. All in the name of beautiful eyes. Let's begin at the beginning, which for the history of eye makeup means we need to go to ancient Egypt. Egypt roughly 3,000 years before the Common Era. The Nile Delta. Reed boats on wide brown water. The smell of baking bread and river mud, and something sharper underneath the mineral smell of the desert, pushing in from all directions, and in households from the modest to the magnificent small stone palettes, grinding stones worn smooth from use, and beside them jars of a dark powdered substance that Egyptian women and men applied around their eyes every single morning with the same routine matter-of-factness that you might apply concealer today. This substance was kohl. Now, kohl is a word that has survived into the modern beauty vocabulary, and you may have seen it on the label of an eyeliner pencil at some point. But the kohl of ancient Egypt was a genuinely different substance from anything sold in a modern cosmetic store with a history and a chemistry that is far more interesting than the name on a pencil suggests. Ancient Egyptian kohl was most commonly made from one of two primary ingredients, galena, which is a naturally occurring mineral form of lead sulfide or stibnite, which is antimony sulfide. Both are dark, lustrous minerals that grind into a fine black powder, and both were mixed with animal fat or oil to create a paste that could be applied with a small stick, typically made of wood ivory or bone, to the upper and lower eyelids and the waterline of the eye. The cosmetic effect was striking. A thick line of dark kohl rimming the entire eye created a dramatic almond-shaped extension of the visible eye that the ancient Egyptians associated with the eye of the god Horus, protective, powerful, spiritually significant. The famous elongated eye shape you see in Egyptian paintings and carvings was not merely artistic convention. It was a representation of what Egyptians actually looked like standing in front of you, their eyes darkened and extended with mineral paste. But here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, and where modern science has offered a perspective that no ancient Egyptian could have anticipated. In 2010, a team of researchers at the French National Centre for Scientific Research published a study in the journal Analytical Chemistry, examining samples of ancient Egyptian coal taken from museum collections, including samples from the Louvre in Paris that dated back more than 3,000 years. What they found was unexpected enough to make headlines in scientific publications around the world. The lead compounds in Egyptian coal, specifically certain lead chloride compounds that formed as byproducts of the manufacturing process, appear to stimulate the production of nitric oxide in human skin cells at low concentrations. And nitric oxide, among its many biological functions, activates the immune system response in the skin around the eyes. In other words, the lead in Egyptian coal may have functioned as a genuine medicine. Applied around the eyes in a region where eye infections, trachoma, and other ocular diseases were endemic and frequently blinding, it may have provided a measurable degree of protection against exactly those conditions, while simultaneously creating the dramatic visual effect that Egyptian culture valued. The ancient Egyptians almost certainly did not understand the mechanism, but they observed over generations that coal wearing seemed to correlate with healthier eyes, and they built that observation into their daily lives so thoroughly that it became inseparable from their identity, their spirituality, and their beauty practice simultaneously. That is not superstition. That is empirical observation without the vocabulary of modern science. And it is, I think, one of the most quietly impressive examples of practical human intelligence in the entire ancient world. Now let us move from the ancient world to the Renaissance, from the Nile to the candlelit drawing rooms of 16th century Italy, because this is where the story of eye beauty takes a turn that is, depending on your perspective, either deeply romantic or genuinely alarming, possibly both. The plant is called Atropa belladonna, in English deadly nightshade, a member of the nightshade family with dark glossy berries, purple flowers, and a history in European folk medicine and poisoning that stretches back at least 2,000 years. The name belladonna is Italian. It means beautiful woman, and it earned that name in the most direct possible way. Italian women of the Renaissance, particularly in the cities of Venice, Florence, and Rome, where the culture of personal elegance and visual refinement was most highly developed, discovered that placing a single drop of extract from the belladonna plant directly onto the surface of the eye caused the pupil to dilate dramatically. A normally sized pupil, perhaps 3 to 4 millimeters in diameter in ordinary light, would expand to 7 or 8 millimeters, filling the iris, making the eye appear darker, larger, and more luminous. The effect by contemporary accounts was genuinely striking. Dilated pupils are associated at neurological level with attraction and emotional engagement. When we're interested in something or someone, our pupils naturally dilate. A woman with artificially dilated pupils would have appeared to everyone looking at her as though she was in a continuous state of deep interest and attraction, as though you specifically had her complete and absorbed attention. It was in effect a pharmacological trick that exploited the neuroscience of attraction, centuries before anyone had a vocabulary for neuroscience. The Venetian physician Pietro Andrea Mattioli documented the practice in his herbal compendium of 1544, describing how women used the juice of belladonna to make their eyes large and beautiful. The practice was apparently widespread enough in Italian aristocratic society that Mattioli considered it worth documenting as a cultural phenomenon rather than a medical curiosity. What Mattioli also documented, however, was the cost. Belladonna, whose active compound atropine is still used in modern ophthalmology for exactly this pupil-dilating purpose, causes at the doses women were using a characteristic and rather significant side effect. It blurs the vision. A woman who had applied belladonna drops to her eyes to appear more beautiful at a social gathering could see the general impression of the room, the candlelight, the moving figures, the broad outlines of faces, but the specific details were soft, uncertain, unreliable. She could not read. She could not easily distinguish one face from another across a room. The world became a beautiful luminous blur, and she walked through it anyway. I want to ask you something here because I think it is worth sitting with. Does that seem completely foreign to you? The idea of making yourself temporarily unable to see clearly in order to appear more beautiful to the people around you? Or does it remind you even a little of something in your own world, the heels that make it difficult to walk, the contacts worn past the point of comfort, the anything that's cost something real in exchange for looking a particular way? The mechanism is different. The logic underneath it is remarkably familiar. Long-term use of belladonna eye drops caused more serious damage. Repeated application of atropine leads to increased sensitivity to light, eventually a severe and debilitating photophobia, where ordinary daylight becomes genuinely painful. It causes chronic blurred vision that does not fully resolve between applications. In extreme cases, it contributed to glaucoma and permanent vision damage. Women who used belladonna regularly and over long periods were in effect trading their long-term eyesight for short-term visual impact. And because the damage accumulated slowly and was difficult to attribute with certainty to a specific cause in an era without ophthalmology as we understand it, many of them likely never made the connection between their beauty practice and their deteriorating vision. The world simply got a little softer around the edges year by year until it stayed that way. And then there are the Beatles. If belladonna is the most poetically tragic ingredient in the history of eye makeup, carmine, the vivid, brilliant red derived from the cochineal insect, is perhaps the most fascinatingly unexpected. The cochineal is a small-scale insect that lives on the pads of prickly pear cactus plants in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. The female of the species, the one that matters for dye purposes, feeds on the cactus and accumulates carminic acid in her body as a defense against predators. That carminic acid, when the insects are harvested, dried and processed, produces a red pigment of extraordinary intensity, stability and versatility that has no close rival in the natural world. The Aztecs had been using cochineal dye for centuries before the Spanish arrived in Mexico in 1519. They used it to dye textiles, to paint and in cosmetic preparations. When the Spanish conquistadors encountered cochineal and understood the extraordinary market that existed in Europe for a stable, vivid red dye, they recognized immediately that they had found something as valuable as silver. By the 1540s, cochineal was being exported to Europe in substantial quantities. By the 1580s, it was the second most valuable export from Spanish colonies in the Americas after silver itself. A single pound of dried cochineal, representing the dried bodies of roughly 70,000 individual insects, was worth significant sums on the European market. And European women discovered within decades of cochineal's arrival that it made an extraordinary cosmetic ingredient, mixed with various substances, egg white gum, Arabic vinegar, fish. Glue cochineal produced lip colours and cheek tints of a vividness and longevity that plant-based red dyes simply could not match. The red of carmine does not fade quickly. It does not turn orange in sunlight or blue in cold. It stays vivid, true and bright in a way that was genuinely revolutionary for European cosmetics. By the 17th and 18th centuries, carmine was a standard ingredient in the rouge, the cheek and lip colour worn by fashionable women across France, England and the rest of Europe. And essentially none of them knew that what they were applying to their lips was derived from insects. The ingredient lists of cosmetics were not something that existed in any public or regulated form in this period. You bought your rouge from an apothecary or a cosmetics vendor, and what was in it was largely between the vendor and their supplier. The cochineal remained hidden inside the beautiful red for centuries. It still appears in cosmetics today listed on ingredient labels as carmine or as natural red 4, or as the colour additive derived from Dactylopius coccus, which is the scientific name for the cochineal insect. It is in lipsticks, blushes, eyeshadows, and food colourings, and the women applying it today, like the women of 17th century Paris, are for the most part entirely unaware that their vibrant red contains the chemistry of a small cactus-dwelling beetle from the mountains of Mexico. There is one more ingredient in this story that I want to tell you about because it sits at the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern medicine in a way that I find genuinely wonderful. In the Victorian era, the 1800s, antimony sulfide, one of the original components of ancient Egyptian coal, made a quiet comeback in the eye cosmetics of Europe and the Middle East. Sold under various names applied to the waterline of the eye in the same way Egyptian women had applied their mineral coal thousands of years earlier, it was used to darken and define the eyes in a manner that was considered both exotic and deeply fashionable. The Victorian physicians who examined this practice were divided. Some considered antimony genuinely dangerous, and in high doses antimony compounds are toxic. Others noted that women who used it regularly seemed to suffer fewer eye infections than those who did not. They could not explain why. The mechanism would not be understood until much later. But the observation was real, and it mapped almost exactly onto what the French researchers would eventually document about Egyptian coal 200 years later. Across 5,000 years and 3 continents, women had independently arrived at a similar conclusion that certain dark minerals applied to the eyes seemed to keep those eyes healthier. The specific mineral, the specific culture, the specific beauty ideal, all different. The underlying empirical observation remarkably stubbornly the same. There is something in that continuity that I find genuinely moving. Not just that women were brave enough to put strange things near their eyes in the name of beauty, but that in doing so across millennia and across the whole width of human civilization, they were also, without knowing it, practicing a form of medicine. The beautiful and the practical were never as separate as we sometimes assume. We have now looked at the face, the hair, the scent, and the eyes. We have moved from lead powder to whale intestines to crushed beetles, and in every single case the story underneath has been the same women navigating extraordinary constraints with extraordinary ingenuity and paying real prices for the beauty standards of their time. But there is one beauty ritual we have not yet discussed that shaped the bodies, not just the faces of women across 4 centuries, one that altered the physical structure of the ribcage, one that physicians argued about endlessly, that feminists eventually rallied against, and that women themselves defended with a passion that surprises people today: the corset. And the story of why women wore it, what it actually did to their bodies, and why the question of whether they were victims or agents of their own choices is far more complicated than it might seem. That is the story coming next. Picture this for a moment. It is 6 o'clock in the morning in London, 1883. A young woman of 20 sits at her dressing table while her lady's maid stands behind her, holding 2 long laces. The young woman grips the bedpost in front of her with both hands. She takes a breath, a full, deep breath. Perhaps the last fully unrestricted one she will take until this evening. And then the maid begins to pull. The corset closes around her torso by degrees, inch by inch, the laces threading through eyelets down the back, drawing the 2 stiffened panels closer together, compressing the ribcage from all sides simultaneously, with a pressure that is not quite pain but is certainly not comfort. The young woman exhales. The maid pulls again. A final tug, a knot, and the thing is done. Her waist, which measured perhaps 26 inches in its natural state, now measures 22. In some households, in some women, in the most extreme versions of this ritual, it measured 18, 16. Occasionally in the darkest corners of Victorian tight-lacing culture, even less. She releases the bedpost, straightens, looks at herself in the mirror, and she looks by the standards of her world exactly right. This is where we need to spend some time tonight, because the corset is perhaps the most debated, most misunderstood, and most politically charged object in the entire history of women's fashion. And the truth about it, as is so often the case with history, is considerably more complicated than either its defenders or its critics have typically been willing to admit. The corset, in something resembling the form we recognise, appeared in European women's fashion in the early 16th century, roughly the 1520s and 1530s in the Spanish court, which was then the most powerful and culturally influential in Europe. The earliest versions were relatively simple, stiffened linen bodices, reinforced with reeds or whalebone, a material which, despite its name, actually came from the flexible plates in the mouths of baleen whales, not from their bones, designed to create a smooth, flat-fronted silhouette from the bust to the hips. The silhouette these early corsets created was not the dramatic hourglass we associate with the Victorian period. It was something more architectural, a smooth conical torso straight-fronted that projected an impression of rigidity and control. The Spanish court aesthetic of the 16th century valued exactly these qualities: stillness, self-containment, and almost statue-like composure. The corset was the physical expression of that value. It made the body look disciplined, and in a world that associated undisciplined bodies with undisciplined minds, that mattered enormously. Over the following 3 centuries, the corset evolved through a series of distinct phases, sometimes emphasizing the bust, sometimes flattening it, sometimes pushing the hips backward into a pronounced curve, sometimes compressing them into a narrow cylinder, tracking the shifting ideals of each era with remarkable fidelity. The corset was not a single object with a single purpose. It was a technology that adapted constantly to reflect what power, femininity, and social respectability were understood to mean in a given decade. By the 1850s and 1860s, the high Victorian period, the corset had become simultaneously more extreme and more widely distributed than at any previous point in its history. Here is a fact that genuinely surprised me when I first encountered it. Corsets in the Victorian period were not exclusively, or even primarily, a luxury item. They were worn by women across the social spectrum, from aristocrats to factory workers, from wealthy merchants' wives to domestic servants. A working-class woman in a cotton mill in Manchester in 1860 would likely have owned at least one corset, probably purchased from a catalogue or a market stall for a few shillings, and worn it to work. The reasons varied depending on the woman. For upper and middle-class women, the corset was a prerequisite of social respectability. Appearing in public without one was considered not merely unfashionable, but morally questionable, a kind of bodily carelessness that implied a carelessness of character. For working-class women, the corset sometimes served a practical function. It supported the back during heavy labour, provided a kind of scaffolding for the torso during long hours of physical work, and perhaps most importantly, signalled that even a woman in difficult circumstances had not entirely surrendered her claim to respectability and self-presentation. The historian Valerie Steele, whose 1988 book, Fashion and Eroticism, remains one of the most thoroughly researched examinations of the Victorian corset, made a point that I think is essential to understanding this object fairly. She documented through an extensive examination of Victorian diaries, letters, and personal accounts that a significant majority of women who wore corsets in the 19th century did not experience them as oppressive. Many described them as comfortable in the sense that a well-fitted, properly constructed corset, broken in gradually over time to the specific shape of its wearer's body, felt supportive and familiar rather than constricting. Some described feeling undressed or even physically insecure without one. This is not to say the corset caused no harm, it did. We will get to that. But it is to say that the image of Victorian women as helpless victims of a garment imposed on them entirely against their will is historically inaccurate. and that inaccuracy matters because it erases the agency and the genuine preferences of real women from their own story. Now the medical question. Because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated and where the Victorian era produced one of the most fascinating and heated public debates in the history of women's health. From at least the 1700s onward, physicians had been raising concerns about the effects of tight corsetry on the female body. By the Victorian period, those concerns had crystallized into a substantial body of medical literature, and the debate between pro-corset and anti-corset physicians in the pages of medical journals was at times genuinely fierce. The anti-corset position held, and there was real evidence for this, that prolonged tight lacing caused compression of the lower ribs, displacement of abdominal organs, including the liver, stomach, and intestines, interference with normal breathing patterns, since the lower lungs could not fully expand, and disruption of circulation in the torso. Victorian physicians who were opposed to tight lacing described fainting, which was genuinely common among corseted women, not as feminine delicacy, but as a physiological consequence of restricted breathing and impaired circulation. Some physicians went further. Dr. Luke Limner, writing in 1870 under the title Madre Natura versus the Moloch of Fashion, argued that tight lacing was responsible for a cascade of health consequences, including digestive disorders, liver disease, and difficulties in childbirth. His writing was vivid, passionate, and it should be said somewhat prone to exaggeration for rhetorical effect. The pro-corset position, also represented in medical literature, argued that a properly fitted corset, one that did not tight lace to an extreme degree, but simply supported and shaped the torso, caused no measurable harm, and actually provided genuine benefits, including lumbar support and relief from back pain. Dr. Lucian Warner, an American physician who also happened to sell a line of health corsets, published a pamphlet in 1874 arguing that corsets were not merely harmless but medically beneficial. Yes, a doctor who sold corsets wrote pamphlets about how corsets were good for you. The Victorian era was nothing if not consistent in its ability to blend commerce and medicine in ways that modern regulatory frameworks exist specifically to prevent. The truth, as modern medical historians have pieced it together, sits somewhere between the extremes of both sides. Studies of skeletal remains from Victorian-era individuals, particularly those published by researcher Rebecca Gibson, and others in the early 2000s examining museum collections, found evidence that long-term corset wearing did in some individuals cause measurable changes to the lower ribs, a slight inward flaring or compression of the floating ribs that would have been produced by consistent pressure over many years. These changes were real. They were also, in most documented cases, relatively modest, not the dramatic rib removal that urban legend has long attributed to Victorian tight laces. The myth that Victorian women had ribs surgically removed to achieve smaller waists is exactly that, a myth. There is no documented medical evidence of this practice occurring at any scale. The story almost certainly arose from a combination of the genuinely unusual waist measurements achieved by extreme tight laces, the public fascination with the corset debate, and the natural human tendency to explain something extreme with an explanation even more extreme. What did happen in the small subset of women who practiced extreme tight lacing, deliberately compressing the waist to measurements below 18 inches, was genuine and sometimes serious physical harm. Chronic pain, digestive difficulties, breathing problems, and in pregnant women real risks to fetal development. The medical literature documented these cases. They were real, but they were also not representative of the typical Victorian woman's experience of her corset. Most women wearing a moderate corset fitted to their natural proportions did not suffer dramatic physical consequences. They were uncomfortable sometimes. They had restricted range of motion sometimes, but they were not, as a general population, being systematically destroyed by their undergarments. Here is the question I want to put to you because I think it is the most interesting one in this entire story. At the height of the Victorian corset debate, the 1880s and 1890s, the women who were most vocal in defending the corset and in defending their right to wear it as they chose were often the same women who were beginning to advocate for greater social and political freedoms in other areas of their lives. They were early feminists in many cases, women who wrote publicly, who organised, who argued passionately for the right to education, to professional employment, to eventually the vote. And yet they also argued with equal passion for the right to tight lace if they wanted to. Because here is what they understood, that the physicians arguing against them sometimes did not the question of whether the corset was harmful, was not the same as the question of who got to decide what a woman did with her own body. A woman in 1885 who said, "I find my corset comfortable and I choose to wear it," was making a statement that was in its own way profoundly modern. She was asserting that her body belonged to her, that her choices about it were hers to make, that well-meaning men, including well-meaning physicians, did not have the authority to override her own assessment of her own experience. The language was different, the context was different, but the argument "my body, my choice" is not a 20th century invention. It was being made clearly and articulately in the letters columns of Victorian magazines and in the published pamphlets of women who had never heard of modern feminism but were practicing it anyway. By the early 1900s, the corset was beginning its long decline, pushed by the rational dress movement, by the first stirrings of the women's suffrage movement, by the practical demands of women entering the workforce in greater numbers, and by a gradual shift in fashion towards softer, more flowing silhouettes that the rigid corset could not accommodate. The designer Paul Poiret claimed rather grandly to have liberated women from the corset, with his looser empire-waisted designs around 1908 and 1909. Women who wore corsets at the time apparently had mixed feelings about being liberated by a man who had not asked their opinion on the matter. By the 1920s, the silhouette had shifted so dramatically toward the flat-chested, narrow-hipped, low-waisted flapper aesthetic that the traditional corset was essentially obsolete. It was replaced gradually by the girdle, which was its own complicated story, and eventually by the bra, which brought its own separate century of debates about comfort support and the relationship between women's bodies and the structures designed to shape them. The corset never entirely disappeared. It exists today as fashion, as fetish, as costume, as a garment that certain women genuinely love, and certain women find genuinely oppressive, sometimes simultaneously. The arguments from the 1880s have never fully resolved. They have simply changed their vocabulary. What strikes me most sitting with this story tonight is not the corset itself. It is the consistency of the argument surrounding it. For 400 years, across every iteration of this garment and every social context in which it appeared, the debate always circled back to the same core question: who decides, who gets to determine what is acceptable, what is harmful, what is beautiful, what a woman's body is for, and what it should look like. The physicians who opposed corsets believed they were protecting women. The reformers who rallied against tight lacing believed they were liberating women. And many of the women at the centre of these debates simply wanted, with a firmness that history has not always given them credit for, to be allowed to make their own determination. That tension between protection and autonomy, between external standards and personal choice, is not a Victorian problem. It is a human problem, and it is, if we are honest, very much still with us. We've been moving tonight through the face and the hair and the eyes and the torso, tracing the extraordinary lengths to which women across history went in pursuit of the beauty standards of their time. But everything we have discussed so far has been rooted in Western Europe and the world it influenced. And the history of beauty, when you begin to look beyond that particular geography, becomes something even stranger and more surprising. Because there are beauty ideals in human history that make lead foundation and belladonna eye drops look almost conservative by comparison. Ideals that involved dyeing teeth permanently black, that required shaving your eyebrows off entirely, that celebrated the colour of skin treated with turmeric until it glowed gold in the evening light. Beauty standards, it turns out, are never universal, and the history of what different cultures considered beautiful and what they did to achieve it is where we are headed next. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment before we continue. Every beauty standard we have discussed tonight, the white face, the towering hair, the dramatic eyes, the compressed waist, has come from one relatively small corner of the world, Western Europe. A particular slice of human civilization across a particular few centuries with a particular set of values about what bodies should look like and what those appearances should communicate. But there are roughly 8 billion people on this planet descended from hundreds of distinct civilizations, each of which developed its own answers to the question that every human culture has ever asked: what does beautiful mean? And when you begin to look at those other answers, when you step outside the familiar geography of Europe, and look at what women in Japan, in Tudor England's neighbour cultures in the Pacific Islands, in the courts of Southeast Asia considered the height of feminine refinement, the story of beauty becomes something far stranger, far more philosophically interesting, and occasionally far more surprising than anything we have covered so far. Because some of those beauty standards look from the outside completely shocking, until you understand them, and then they make a kind of sense that is more illuminating than anything a mirror could show you. Let us begin in Japan. Specifically, let us begin in the Heian period, the era stretching from 794 to 1185, which is widely considered the golden age of classical Japanese culture. A period of extraordinary literary and artistic achievement, when the Japanese imperial court at Kyoto produced some of the most sophisticated poetry fiction and visual art in the ancient world. The women of the Heian court were by any measure remarkable human beings. They were highly educated, often multilingual in classical Chinese as well as Japanese, accomplished poets and musicians and participants in a court culture of extraordinary aesthetic refinement. The great novel, The Tale of Genji, written by the noblewoman Murasaki Shikibu around the year 1008, is considered by many literary historians to be the world's first novel, and it was written by a woman in a court where women's intellectual lives were taken seriously in ways that had no parallel in Europe at the same period. And these women, these educated, accomplished, culturally sophisticated women, blackened their teeth, deliberately, methodically, as a regular part of their beauty and grooming routine. The practice was called ohaguro, and it involved applying a solution, typically an iron-based liquid, made by soaking iron filings in vinegar, or sake sometimes mixed with powdered gallnut for tannins to the teeth, which reacted chemically to produce a deep, permanent-looking black stain. The solution tasted by contemporary accounts genuinely terrible. It smelled of rust and vinegar. It required regular reapplication to maintain the depth and evenness of the colour, and it was in the Heian court and for many centuries afterward in Japanese society one of the clearest markers of beauty status and adult femininity that existed. Now, before we simply dismiss this as inexplicable, let me offer you the framework within which it made complete sense. The Heian aesthetic ideal was built around a concept the Japanese called mono no aware, a phrase that roughly translates as the pathos of things, a bittersweet sensitivity to beauty and impermanence. Within this framework, the natural, unaltered tooth, white gleaming, slightly animalistic, was considered raw, unfinished, even slightly alarming. It suggested an unpolished creature, someone who had not yet been transformed by culture and refinement into something elevated. The blackened tooth, by contrast, was a tooth that had been worked on, transformed, deliberately altered by human intention. It was the tooth of someone who had submitted their natural self to the demands of culture and beauty. In a world that valued the cultivated over the natural, the transformed over the unaltered black teeth were not a flaw to be concealed. They were evidence of civilization itself. The practice spread far beyond the Heian court. By the medieval period, a haguro was practiced by married women across Japanese society. It became over centuries a marker of marital status as much as of beauty. A woman with black teeth was a wife, a woman of settled domestic life, a woman who had made her commitment to the social order visible on her body in the most permanent way available. It was only in 1870, during the Meiji Restoration, when Japan deliberately opened itself to Western influence and began adopting Western cultural standards at extraordinary speed, that ohaguro was officially banned as part of a broad effort to align Japanese appearance norms with those of Europe and America. The Japanese women who had practiced ohaguro for their entire lives did not for the most part experience its prohibition as liberation. They experienced it, many of them, as a loss, an erasure of a practice that had been for them deeply connected to identity, to status, to their sense of who they were as women in their world. Now let us cross to the other side of the world, to a very different culture, a very different century, and a beauty standard that involves the forehead rather than the teeth. Medieval Europe, roughly the 1300s through the 1500s. You may not know the name Margaret of Austria. She was a noblewoman of the early 16th century Duchess of Savoy, and one of the most politically capable women of her era, serving as regent of the Netherlands for nearly 3 decades, with a shrewdness that earned the respect of kings across the continent. But what I want you to notice if you look at her portrait painted around 1518 is her forehead. It is enormous, not by any natural accident of anatomy, but because the beauty ideal of 15th and early 16th century Europe, a standard particularly dominant in France, Burgundy and the courts of the Low Countries, held that a high, broad, smooth forehead was the single most important feature of feminine beauty, higher than any forehead nature typically produced, and so women created the forehead they needed. They did it in 2 ways, often simultaneously. First, by plucking or shaving the hairline, drawing it back 1, 2, even 3 inches from its natural position to expose more forehead. Second, by plucking the eyebrows completely in most cases, so that no hair interrupted the smooth expanse of skin between the eye socket and the hairline. The tools available for this were razor tweezers made of bone or metal and a remarkable patience for discomfort, contemporary beauty manuals, and they existed specific written guides to achieving the fashionable look offered recipes for depilatories made from quicklime and other caustic substances that could be applied to the hairline to kill the follicles and prevent regrowth. Quicklime applied to the face to push the hairline backward. We have now, I think, established that the history of beauty contains essentially no limits on what women have been willing to do in pursuit of the prevailing standard. But why the forehead? Why was this specific feature elevated to such cultural significance? The answer connects to the intellectual culture of the Renaissance, a period that revered classical learning reason and the life of the mind. A high forehead was associated in the visual vocabulary of the period with intelligence, with wisdom, with the capacity for elevated thought. It was in a literal and not merely metaphorical sense the physical indicator of a large mind. To have a high forehead was to look like a person who thought, and in a culture that was beginning to value thinking and beginning to allow cautiously and partially that women might be capable of it, that association carried real weight. The women who plucked their hairlines back were not simply following a fashion trend. They were making a claim. They were inscribing on their own bodies the suggestion that they were the kind of women whose minds were worth taking seriously. Let us travel one more time further from Europe, this time to the islands of the Pacific, and to a beauty ritual that involves not removal, not compression, not toxicity, but something far gentler and more fragrant. Turmeric. The golden yellow root of the plant curcuma longa native to South Asia and Southeast Asia used in cooking medicine and religious ceremony for at least 4,000 years, and used in the beauty rituals of women across the Pacific Islands, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Hawaii, and many others in ways that were both practically effective and ceremonially profound. In traditional Fijian culture, for example, turmeric called cargo in Fijian was mixed with coconut oil and applied to the skin of women for a range of purposes, including as a preparation for ceremonies, as a treatment for skin conditions, as a marker of high social status, and as a genuine expression of beauty that the culture valued deeply. The golden yellow tint it left on the skin, warm, luminous, visibly different from untreated skin, was considered beautiful in a way that was tied directly to the richness of the turmeric itself. Gold was valuable. Gold was sacred. Gold on the skin of a woman connected her visually and spiritually to something larger than herself. In traditional Hawaiian culture, turmeric was one of the plants carried by the original Polynesian settlers in their extraordinary ocean voyages, brought deliberately because it was considered essential enough to preserve across thousands of miles of open Pacific. Its use in beauty and ceremony was not a casual practice. It was a thread connecting living women to their ancestors, to their islands, to the knowledge carried across generations in the hands and memories of the women who came before them. And here is something that modern science has confirmed in a way that should not surprise us anymore given what we learned earlier about coal and antimony. Turmeric contains a compound called curcumin that has documented antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory properties. Applied to the skin regularly, it genuinely protects against certain infections and skin conditions. It is effective sunscreen in a mild sense, providing some protection against ultraviolet light in climates where sun exposure is intense and constant. The women of the Pacific who applied turmeric to their skin every day were once again, as with the Egyptian coal, as with the Victorian antimony, practicing medicine without knowing they were practicing medicine. The beauty ritual and the health practice were not separate things. They had never been separated. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something directly. We have now looked at black teeth in Heian, Japan, at plucked hairlines in medieval Burgundy, at golden skin in the Pacific Islands, and I suspect that at least one of those, probably the black teeth, gave you a moment of instinctive discomfort, a flicker of something that might be described as "that seems wrong," or "that seems strange." And I want to gently invite you to examine that instinct. Because here is what is interesting. Every single person reading or listening to this tonight carries inside them a set of beliefs about what is beautiful and what is not. That feels from the inside completely natural, completely obvious, almost pre-social, as though you were simply born knowing that white teeth are more beautiful than black ones, that a hairline should sit where nature places it, that pale skin is one valid ideal, and golden skin is another. But none of those beliefs were there when you arrived in the world. Every single one was taught to you by your culture, your media, your family, the 10,000 images you have absorbed over your lifetime of what beauty looks like in your particular corner of the world. The Heian noblewoman looking at your unaltered white teeth would have found them as strange and unfinished as you find her black ones. The 15th century Burgundian lady looking at your unplugged hairline would have thought you simply had not gotten around to your grooming yet. The Fijian woman seeing your unanointed skin might have wondered who was responsible for taking care of you. Beauty is a language, and like all languages it is learned, not innate, and like all languages it is the one you grew up speaking that sounds like silence, like simply the way things are. The others sound foreign until you learn to hear what they are actually saying. There is one final example I want to share in this part of our journey tonight because it comes from a culture you might consider familiar, and yet the specific practice is one that most people in modern Europe and America have genuinely never heard of. In Elizabethan England, the same England where women were spreading white lead across their faces, which we discussed right at the beginning of tonight, there was a secondary fashion among certain women of the court, involving something called plumpers. Plumpers were small balls made of cork, most commonly that women placed inside their cheeks, between the teeth and the inner cheek wall, to create the appearance of full rounded cheeks. As women aged and their teeth were lost, tooth loss was extremely common in the 16th and 17th centuries. Given the state of dental care, the cheeks naturally hollowed. The plumpers restored the rounded youthful fullness that was considered beautiful. They were also, by all accounts, extremely difficult to speak clearly with. Contemporary references describe women who wore plumpers having a slightly muffled, imprecise quality to their speech, which led to the social challenge of either removing them to speak clearly, thereby revealing their absence, or keeping them in place, and simply being somewhat difficult to understand. Most apparently chose the latter, which tells you perhaps more efficiently than any historical analysis could exactly how seriously women of that era took the maintenance of their appearance even at the cost of being clearly heard. What connects black teeth in Kyoto, plucked hairlines in Bruges, golden skin in Fiji, and cork balls in the cheeks of Elizabethan ladies? At one level, nothing. They are products of entirely different cultures, different centuries, different cosmologies about what the body means and what beauty is for. But at another level, everything, every single one of these practices was understood by the women who performed it as an act of cultivation, of taking the raw material of the natural body and transforming it through effort, through discomfort, through skill, into something that belonged to culture rather than merely to nature. Something that communicated, I am a person who has been shaped by the values of my world. I know the language, I speak it fluently. Beauty in every culture that has ever existed has been a form of communication. The vocabulary changes, the grammar shifts. The things being said underneath it all remain remarkably stubbornly similar. We have travelled a long way tonight, from ancient Egypt to Renaissance Italy, to the Pacific Islands, to the courts of Japan, and in all of these places across all of these centuries, women were finding extraordinary ways to transform their appearance in pursuit of their culture's ideal. But there is one category of beauty ritual we have not yet entered, one that is in some ways the most intimate, the most private, and the most surprising of all. What happened after the guests went home? After the corset came off, after the powdered wig was removed, after the doors were locked and the candles burned low? What did women put on their faces before they went to sleep? The history of the nighttime beauty routine, what women applied to their skin in the quiet hours of the night, hoping to wake up more beautiful than they fell asleep, is filled with ingredients that will make you laugh, ingredients that will make you wince, and at least one ingredient that a modern dermatologist would genuinely endorse. That story is next. The house is quiet now. The dinner guests have gone. The candles in the front rooms have been extinguished one by one. The servants have retired, and somewhere in the private chambers of a Roman villa, or a medieval manor, or a Renaissance palazzo, or a Victorian townhouse, a woman sits alone at her dressing table in the low, soft light of a single lamp, and begins the ritual that no one else was meant to see. The daytime face, the public face, the careful construction of powder and pigment and pomade is coming off. And what goes on in its place is something far more intimate, far stranger, and in some cases far more surprising than anything she wore into the world that day. The nighttime beauty routine is perhaps the most honest chapter in the history of women and beauty, because it was private. It was not performed for an audience. It was just a woman alone doing what she genuinely believed would make her more beautiful by morning. And what women across 2,000 years genuinely believed would make them more beautiful by morning is a story that involves sheep fat bread soaked in wine, raw meat laid carefully against the cheeks, crocodile excrement. Yes, we will get to that. And at least one ingredient that a modern cosmetic chemist would look at and say, actually, that works. Let us begin in ancient Rome. Again, Because Rome, as we have established, was ahead of its time in ways both admirable and genuinely alarming. The Roman writer and naturalist Pliny the Elder, who compiled his monumental encyclopedia Naturalis Historia around 77 in the Common Era, devoted a surprisingly substantial section of that work to cosmetics and skincare. Pliny was on balance not a great admirer of cosmetic practices. He had a tendency toward the curmudgeonly on the subject, but his documentation of what Roman women were actually doing to their skin is invaluable, precisely because of his disapproval. He recorded these things in order to criticize them, which means he recorded them accurately. Among the nighttime preparations he described was a face mask made from the fat of sheep, specifically the internal fat surrounding the kidneys called soot, mixed with rose water and sometimes honey. This mixture was applied to the face at bedtime and worn overnight, intended to moisturize and soften the skin. In the morning it would be removed with water or with a cloth dampened with rose water. Now, before you make a face, and I understand if you are making a face, consider that lanolin, the fat derived from sheep's wool and wool secretions, is to this day one of the most effective natural skin moisturizers known to dermatology. It is in skin creams, in lip balms, in nipple creams, in a range of high-end moisturizing products sold today at prices that would astonish a Roman noblewoman. The specific form the Romans were using, rendered kidney fat, is not identical to lanolin, but the underlying chemistry is similar. They were empirically not wrong. Pliny also documented a preparation involving barley flower eggs, bulbs of the plant called narcissus, and honey mixed into a paste and applied to the face overnight for smoothing and brightening. The honey component in particular has genuine antimicrobial and humectant properties. Honey draws moisture into the skin from the surrounding air and holds it there, which is why it appears in modern skincare formulations. The Romans did not know why it worked, but they observed that it did, and they used it for centuries. And then there was the crocodile excrement. I want to be precise about this because it is the kind of detail that sounds invented but is not. Pliny documented with what reads as genuine bewilderment that certain Roman women of his era used crocodile dung as a face mask, applying it to the skin in the belief that it would lighten and brighten the complexion. This was not apparently a fringe practice. Pliny records it as something sufficiently common to be worth documenting, and later Roman writers reference it as well. The crocodile dung in question was imported. Crocodiles were not native to Italy, which means that someone somewhere in the supply chain of the Roman cosmetics trade was in the business of collecting packaging and shipping crocodile excrement from Egypt or North Africa to the cosmetics vendors of Rome. There was a market, there were customers, there was presumably a price list. I have thought about this more than I probably should have, and the conclusion I keep arriving at is simply, if it had not worked at all at any level, the practice would not have survived long enough for Pliny to document it. Dung of various animals contains urea, a compound that is in fact used in modern dermatology as a keratolytic agent, meaning something that gently dissolves and removes dead skin cells. The exfoliating effect would have been real. The other aspects of the experience, I imagine, were considerably less pleasant. Moving forward several centuries through the collapse of the Western Roman Empire through the early medieval period into the High Middle Ages, the nighttime beauty routine did not disappear. It adapted to the available ingredients, the available knowledge, and the particular anxieties of a new era. Medieval European beauty manuscripts, and they existed more of them than you might expect, described preparations that were applied to the face at night, with specific intentions to soften the skin, to reduce the appearance of blemishes, to slow the visible effects of aging. One preparation documented in the 12th century medical school of Salerno, arguably the most sophisticated medical institution in medieval Europe, and one that took women's health seriously enough to have female practitioners on its faculty, involved bread soaked in wine applied as a poultice to the face overnight. The alcohol in the wine would have had a mild antiseptic effect. The starch of the bread softened and broken down would have provided some occlusion, that is, it would have created a slight barrier that reduced moisture loss from the skin overnight. The trotula, a collection of medical and cosmetic texts associated with the Salerno school and compiled in the 12th century, is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of women's beauty, because it approaches the subject with a seriousness and a systematic rigour that most modern people do not associate with medieval medicine. It includes preparations for the face, the hair, the hands and the body, many of which use ingredients, honey, egg white, rosewater, plant oils, that modern formulation chemists would recognize as functional. One preparation in the trotula for improving skin texture calls for fat of goose hen or duck mixed with white wax and rosewater, heated gently together and allowed to cool into a cream which is structurally a basic emulsion, an oil in water or water in oil mixture that would spread smoothly onto the skin and remain in contact with it overnight. This is in its fundamental chemistry not dramatically different from a basic moisturizing cream you might buy in a pharmacy today. The women using these preparations in 12th century Salerno were working without any knowledge of cell biology of the epidermis and dermis, of transepidermal water loss or ceramide function, but they were observing systematically what made skin look and feel better, and they were refining their preparations over generations of practice. That is not magic. That is science practiced without the vocabulary of science. Now the Renaissance, and a preparation that I think is genuinely the most fascinating in this entire history, because it involves a woman who was both a queen and apparently a serious amateur chemist, Catherine de' Medici, who we met briefly earlier in the context of her perfumer. Renée the Florentine maintained alongside her political activities and her reputation for courtly intrigue and extensive private laboratory at the French court, where she personally oversaw the development of cosmetic and medicinal preparations. This is documented. It is not legend. Contemporary accounts from her household describe a dedicated room, sometimes called her laboratory or her still room, equipped with distillation apparatus with jars of prepared ingredients, with the tools of what we would now call practical chemistry. Catherine was intellectually serious about this work. She corresponded with physicians, with apothecaries, with the alchemical scholars of her era about the properties of various ingredients and the best methods for extracting and combining them. Among the nighttime preparations attributed to her personal development or patronage, based on recipes that circulated in French court circles and that later appeared in printed beauty manuals, was a face treatment involving the white of eggs, the milk of almonds, and a distillation of lily flowers that was applied before sleep as a mask intended to whiten and smooth the complexion. The lily distillation water distilled from lily flowers and collected as a clear liquid was a genuine product of the alchemical tradition, using the same distillation technology that had been developed for perfumery. Its specific cosmetic properties are debatable, but the almond milk component contains emollient oils that genuinely soften skin, and the egg white applied to the face and allowed to dry creates a temporary tightening effect as the proteins contract, producing, in the short term, a smoother appearance that would have been visible and noticeable the following morning. Is this moisturizing cream by modern standards? No, but it is also not nothing. It is a real preparation made with real skill, producing real observable effects in the private laboratory of a woman who was simultaneously running one of the most complex political courts in 16th century Europe. I find something genuinely wonderful in that image. Catherine de' Medici, between diplomatic negotiations and court intrigues, and the management of 3 royal sons, finding time to experiment with lily flower distillations for her skin. Priorities, I suppose, are always personal. Let us jump now to Victorian England, the 1860s and 1870s, and a beauty preparation that represents perhaps the single most uncomfortable entry On our entire list tonight, the raw meat mask. Ellen Montagu, a celebrated English society beauty of the mid-Victorian period, was widely reported in the beauty columns of ladies' magazines of the era to sleep with thin slices of raw beef laid across her face every night. The beef was positioned carefully over the cheeks, the forehead, and the area around the eyes, held loosely in place and left in contact with the skin for several hours of sleep. She was not alone. Raw meat, specifically raw beef, though occasionally veal appears in multiple Victorian beauty manuals and personal testimonies as a nighttime skin treatment intended to soften the complexion, reduce puffiness around the eyes, and maintain the smooth, even skin texture that Victorian beauty culture valued. The reasoning in the medical understanding of the period was connected to the idea that the vital essences of fresh meat could be absorbed through the skin, nourishing and revitalizing the tissue from the outside. This is not how skin biology works. Proteins do not absorb through the intact skin barrier in any meaningful way under normal conditions. However, and this is the part that genuinely surprised me, the physical properties of cold raw meat do have measurable effects on facial skin. Cold meat placed against the face causes vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels near the surface, which temporarily reduces puffiness and redness in the same way that a cold compress would. The physical pressure of the meat against the skin provides a mild occlusive effect, slightly reducing moisture evaporation from the skin surface overnight. So the Victorian woman waking up in the morning after sleeping with raw beef on her face was not imagining the improvement she saw in the mirror. She was seeing a real, if temporary, effect produced by a mechanism entirely different from what she believed, but real nonetheless. The laundry situation, however, must have been interesting. Now I want to tell you about something that sits at the other end of the spectrum entirely, an ingredient used in nighttime skincare across multiple cultures and multiple centuries that modern science has validated so thoroughly that it now costs significant money in a bottle with clean packaging and minimalist fonts. Snail mucin. In ancient Greece, the physician Hippocrates, whose writings on medicine date to the 5th century before the Common Era, documented the use of snail secretions mixed with sour milk as a treatment for skin inflammation and irritation. This is one of the earliest documented references to topical skincare in the Western medical tradition. But the most remarkable chapter in the history of snail-based skincare comes from a much more recent source than ancient Greece, and it is a story that connects a traditional beauty practice to modern biotechnology in the most unexpected way. In Chile in the 1980s, a family of snail farmers who raised Helix aspersa snails, the common garden snail essentially for the French escargot market, began to notice something unusual. The workers who handled the snails daily, who had regular contact with the mucus secreted by the snails as they were processed, had remarkably smooth, soft and quickly healing skin on their hands. Cuts healed faster than expected. Roughness and irritation disappeared. The skin in contact with snail mucus was visibly and measurably different from skin that was not. This observation was taken seriously. Research followed, and what the researchers found was that snail mucus contains a genuinely extraordinary combination of compounds, hyaluronic acid, which holds enormous amounts of moisture in skin tissue, glycoproteins that stimulate collagen production, allantoin, which promotes cell regeneration and wound healing, and various antioxidants that protect skin cells from oxidative damage. These are not folk medicine concepts. These are documented, peer-reviewed, molecularly characterized compounds with specific measurable effects on skin biology. Snail mucin is now a major ingredient in Korean beauty products, in high-end European serums, in mainstream skincare lines, sold in department stores across the United States and Europe. It is extensively researched, genuinely effective and expensive. and the ancient Greek women who were applying snail preparations to their skin in the 5th century before the Common Era, who had no knowledge of hyaluronic acid or collagen production or cell regeneration, were once again doing something that worked. The pattern at this point should feel familiar. Across every era we have visited tonight, the women mixing their nighttime preparations, the sheep fat, the bread and wine, the egg white and almond milk, the raw beef, the snail mucus were working by observation and inheritance rather than by scientific theory. They were noticing what their grandmothers had noticed, and their grandmothers before them, stretching back into the wordless accumulation of female practical knowledge that predates writing. They did not always get it right. The crocodile dung probably did more harm than good taken as a whole. Some preparations contained ingredients we now know to be irritating or actively harmful. But the hit rate, the proportion of historical nighttime beauty preparations that modern science can look at and say, yes, that actually does something useful, is considerably higher than you might expect from a tradition operating entirely without molecular biology. There is one more nighttime ritual I want to share before we move on, because it is the most poignant one I encountered in all of this research. Queen Isabella I of Castile, who ruled Spain from 1474 to 1504, who sponsored the voyages of Christopher Columbus, who was by any measure one of the most powerful and consequential rulers of the 15th century, was known in the private records of her household to follow a specific nighttime skin routine in her later years. She applied oil of almonds to her face and hands each evening before sleep. She used a preparation of rosewater and white wax as a basic cream. She maintained, according to contemporary accounts, a careful and consistent approach to her skin that she sustained even during military campaigns, even during the siege of Granada, even during the years when she was effectively running a war. There is something about that image that stops me. A queen on a military campaign, in a tent, applying almond oil to her face before sleep, not out of vanity in any shallow sense, but because the maintenance of appearance for a woman in her position was not separable from the maintenance of authority. To appear composed, controlled, and physically dignified was part of the work of being taken seriously as a ruler. The nighttime ritual was not separate from the political life. It was part of it. And at the same time, I think it was also just a woman tired from a long and difficult day, finding something quiet and familiar and personal in the small private act of taking care of herself. Both things can be true. They usually are. The bedroom, the dressing table, the low light of a single candle. These are the settings where the most honest history of beauty happens. Not in the public portraits, not in the satirical cartoons, not in the medical debates, but in the private moment repeated across 2,000 years of a woman alone with her own face doing what she's been taught, and what she believes, and what she hopes will carry her a little more beautiful into whatever the next day brings. That moment has never stopped. It is happening right now somewhere in 1,000 bedrooms with ingredients that would be utterly unrecognizable to Pliny or to Catherine de Medici or to the Victorian woman with her raw beef, and yet performing in the fundamental human sense exactly the same act. We have spent the night so far with faces and hair and eyes and waists and teeth, and the quiet intimacy of the nighttime routine. And in all of these stories, the beauty was applied to the outside, rubbed in, pressed on, built up, painted over. But there is a chapter in the history of women and beauty that goes further than the surface. A chapter where women did not apply beauty to their skin. They swallowed it. The history of what women consumed, what they drank, what they ate, what they took in pill form from Victorian pharmacists, in the belief that it would change how they looked from the inside out, is one of the most startling and most revealing chapters in this entire story. And it is exactly where we're headed next. Somewhere in London in the year 1882, a woman walks into a pharmacy. not to collect medicine for an illness, not to fill a prescription from a physician. She walks in with money in her hand and a very specific request she would like please a box of Dr. James P. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion wafers. The pharmacist does not hesitate. He does not ask why she wants them or whether she's consulted a doctor. He reaches behind the counter, sets a small box on the glass surface between them, names a price, and the transaction is complete. The woman drops the box into her bag and walks back out into the grey London afternoon. She will take one wafer with her breakfast, one with her dinner, and in a few weeks, if the advertisements in the ladies' magazines are to be believed, her complexion will be clearer, smoother, more luminous, more alive. The dullness and blemishes that have been troubling her will fade. She will look, as the copy promises, refreshed and radiant. What the advertisement does not mention, what the pharmacist does not say, is that the active ingredient in those small, pleasant-looking wafers is one of the most effective poisons in the natural world. This is the story of what women swallowed in the name of beauty, and it is in some ways the most intimate and the most disturbing chapter in this entire history, because when you spread something on your skin, there is at least a degree of separation between the substance and your body. When you swallow something, you're inviting it all the way in. We touched briefly on arsenic in part 1 of tonight's journey in the context of external cosmetics. But the internal consumption of arsenic for beauty purposes is its own distinct and genuinely extraordinary story, one that reaches further back, spans more cultures, and involves more voluntary and formed participation than most people realize. Let us establish the basic science first, because it matters for understanding why this practice persisted. Arsenic in small doses produces a characteristic set of visible effects on the human body. It causes a slight dilation of blood vessels near the surface of the skin, producing what contemporaries described as a rosy, luminous, almost translucent quality to the complexion. It suppresses certain bacterial skin conditions, reducing blemishes and roughness. It stimulates the production of red blood cells, in some cases improving the colour and apparent vitality of the skin, and it creates, through mechanisms that involve the disruption of normal cell metabolism, a slight fattening effect in the subcutaneous tissue, filling out the face and giving it a plump, smooth appearance. All of these effects are real. They are temporary. They come at extraordinary long-term cost, but in the short to medium term, they genuinely produce the appearance of improved health and beauty, which is why women noticed them, shared them, and kept consuming arsenic for generations. The arsenic-eating practice in Styria, the Austrian mountain region which we mentioned in passing earlier tonight, deserves the fuller treatment it has been waiting for. Because the Styrian case is not merely a curiosity, it is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of deliberate cosmetic self-poisoning in history, and the accounts of it read in places with an almost surreal quality. British physician Dr. John Mackintosh travelled to Styria in the 1860s specifically to investigate the reports of arsenic-eating women that had been circulating in European medical literature. What he found there, documented in his subsequent publications, was a practice that was by local standards entirely unremarkable. Women in certain mountain villages had been consuming arsenic, typically in the form of white arsenic trioxide obtained from local sources, for generations. They began in small doses, perhaps a grain or less at a time, and built up their tolerance gradually over months and years until they were consuming quantities that would have been rapidly fatal to someone without tolerance. And the women Mackintosh encountered were not sickly or diminished. Many of them were, by his account, apparently healthy, physically vigorous, and notably clear-skinned. Their cheeks were rosy, their eyes were bright. They looked from the outside like the advertisement for a product, rather than the warning on its label. Mackintosh was troubled by this. He understood enough toxicology to know what arsenic did at higher doses. He could see the evidence of the practice's popularity, and he struggled in his published writing to reconcile the visible evidence of apparent health with the knowledge of what these women were putting into their bodies. The answer, which he did not fully have the tools to articulate, is that chronic low-level arsenic consumption produces visible cosmetic benefits in the short and medium term while accumulating damage in the body that manifests typically in later life. The liver, the nervous system, the skin itself over the long term all suffer. But the suffering is delayed and gradual in a way that makes attribution difficult without modern diagnostic tools. The women of Styria were paying a deferred price. They simply did not know it. The Victorian era in England brought arsenic consumption to an urban commercial scale that the mountain villages of Styria could never have anticipated. Dr. James P. Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion wafers, which we met at the opening of this section, were one of dozens of similar products sold openly in British and American pharmacies throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and into the 1890s. They were advertised in women's magazines alongside perfume, corsetry, and household goods. They were priced accessibly enough that working-class women could afford them alongside upper-class ones. The marketing was extraordinary in its brazenness. One advertisement for a competing product, arsenic complexion wafers, sold under the brand name of Dr. Rose's, described the product as perfectly harmless and recommended by physicians. Another claimed that the wafers produce a brilliant transparency of the skin, remove all eruptions, and give the complexion that soft velvety appearance so much admired. The phrase perfectly harmless appeared so frequently in arsenic beauty product advertising of this period that it begins to read as the Victorian equivalent of a legal disclaimer, a phrase deployed so routinely that it had ceased to carry any actual meaning. Were there voices of concern? Absolutely. The Lancet, the preeminent British medical journal, published multiple articles in the 1870s and 1880s, raising alarm about arsenic-containing cosmetics and complexion preparations. The British Medical Journal followed. Several prominent physicians wrote publicly that these products were dangerous and should be regulated or banned. The regulation, however, was slow in coming. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had placed arsenic on a list of scheduled poisons in Britain, which theoretically meant it could only be sold by registered pharmacists in limited quantities, with the buyer's name recorded in a poison register. In practice, this requirement was inconsistently enforced and did not apply to proprietary products, packaged goods with brand names, in the same way it applied to raw arsenic sold in bulk. The wafers sat in a legal grey zone. They were packaged products. They had brand names. They had pleasant-sounding medical credentials attached to them, however fraudulent, and they kept selling. But arsenic was only the most dramatic entry in a much longer list of substances that Victorian and earlier women consumed in the belief that ingesting them would alter their appearance. Let us talk about vinegar. In the 1820s and 1830s, a specific aesthetic swept through upper-class European and American society that we now call the consumptive ideal, or somewhat more poetically, the romantic ideal of feminine beauty. Its most direct inspiration was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, killed an enormous proportion of the population in the 19th century. It killed the young with particular frequency, which meant that many of its victims were at the stage of life when physical appearance is at its most vivid. And the early stages of tuberculosis produced a specific visual effect that in the aesthetics of romantic poetry and art became associated with a kind of ethereal, otherworldly beauty. The consumptive woman was pale. Her lips were faintly flushed against her white skin. Her eyes were bright, the unusual brightness produced by low-grade fever. Her frame was slender, almost translucent. She appeared to be not entirely of this world, suspended between the earthly and the spiritual in a way that Romantic culture found deeply compelling. The poet Lord Byron, one of the most culturally influential figures of the early 19th century, famously declared that he should like to die of consumption because of the picturesque quality of the disease's visible effects. He was joking, probably. Mostly. But the sentiment reflected something real about how his culture was aestheticizing a deadly illness into a beauty standard, and women finding themselves in a culture that had decided the appearance of illness was desirable, set about achieving it by any means available. Drinking vinegar was among the most popular methods. Vinegar consumed regularly in small quantities causes a degree of gastric distress that suppresses appetite, leading to weight loss, and the slender frame associated with the consumptive ideal. It also, over time, produces a slight pallor. The body under chronic mild acid stress does not maintain the rosy colour of full health, and it creates reportedly a heightened sensitivity and emotional intensity that some women found added to the quality of melancholy refinement that Romantic culture valued. The fashion writer and social commentator Harriet Wilson documented in the 1830s that vinegar drinking as a weight control and complexion management strategy was widespread among fashionable English women, noting with a certain dry wit that the results were occasionally rather too effective, that women who pursued the consumptive ideal with genuine commitment sometimes developed a pallor and frailty indistinguishable from actual illness, which in retrospect should not be entirely surprising. Lord Byron himself, incidentally, was a famously obsessive dieter throughout his adult life, alternating between near-starvation periods and episodes of binge-eating, drinking copious quantities of vinegar, and at one point subsisting for extended periods on a diet of biscuits and soda water. His famous beauty, those dark eyes, that pale, dramatic face, was maintained in significant part through practices that we would now recognize as severely disordered eating. The consumptive ideal, in other words, was not merely a passive aesthetic, it was a practice, and it caused real harm to real people in pursuit of a beauty standard that was literally modelled on a fatal disease. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think this moment in the story is worth sitting with. The Romantic era's aestheticization of tuberculosis sounds from our vantage point almost incomprehensible. How does a culture decide that looking like you are dying is beautiful? How does that happen? And yet, and I ask this genuinely, not rhetorically, is the line between that and our own era's beauty ideals as clear as we might like. The thinness that has been idealized in Western fashion for much of the 20th and 21st centuries has its own body count. The pressure to maintain an appearance of effortless health, while restricting food, while over-exercising, while pursuing specific body dimensions that require real sacrifice to achieve, is that so categorically different from drinking vinegar to look interestingly pale. I am not drawing a direct equivalence. The mechanisms are different, the specific ideals are different, the cultural contexts are enormously different. But the fundamental structure, a beauty standard that requires physical suffering to achieve, normalize so thoroughly that the suffering becomes invisible, that structure is not unique to the Victorian era. It is just that from inside a standard, you cannot see it the way you can see it from outside. Moving to the other end of the spectrum, away from the deliberate pursuit of pallor and toward the pursuit of inner radiance, let us spend a moment with some of the more optimistic entries in the history of beauty from the inside. In ancient India, the Ayurvedic medical tradition, which dates in its earliest written form to roughly 1500 to 1000 before the Common Era, included a substantial body of practice around what it called beauty tonics, preparations consumed internally to improve the appearance of skin, hair and eyes from within. Many of these were plant-based. Turmeric, which we encountered in Part 6 as a topical treatment in Pacific Island beauty culture, was also consumed internally in Ayurvedic practice mixed with milk and honey as a preparation believed to improve skin clarity and radiance. The anti-inflammatory properties of curcumin consumed internally do have measurable effects on systemic inflammation, and chronic low-level inflammation is one of the primary drivers of dull, uneven skin tone. Once again, the mechanism that the ancient practitioners understood was entirely different from what we now understand. The effect was real in both cases. Ashwagandha, saffron and amla, Indian gooseberry, one of the densest sources of vitamin C in the plant world, were all consumed in various Ayurvedic beauty preparations with specific intentions regarding their effects on appearance. The vitamin C in amla supports collagen synthesis, which is directly relevant to skin structure and elasticity. This is not a coincidence. It is the product of thousands of years of careful observation. The Ayurvedic practitioners were not guessing. They were doing what every tradition we have encountered tonight was doing, watching carefully over generations and recording what worked. Back in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, a category of preparation called beauty waters, distilled herbal liquids intended for internal consumption, occupied a significant place in the beauty routines of upper-class women. These were not perfumes or topical preparations, they were drinks, carefully distilled infusions of flowers, herbs and other ingredients consumed in small quantities, an ounce or two at a time, in the belief that they would improve the complexion, brighten the eyes, and create an inner luminosity that would manifest visibly on the surface. The most famous of these was probably Hungary water, a preparation first documented in the 14th century and attributed through legend to the Queen of Hungary, who reportedly used it both topically and internally, and credited it with maintaining her beauty and vitality into old age. Hungary water was based primarily on rosemary distilled in wine or spirits, and its internal use was advocated in beauty manuals across Europe well into the 18th century. Whether it had any meaningful cosmetic effect when consumed is doubtful by modern standards. Rosemary contains antioxidant compounds, and the alcohol base would have had its own physiological effects. But the practice is interesting less for its efficacy than for what it reveals about how women in this period conceptualized beauty. The idea that you could drink something and become more beautiful, that beauty was not solely a matter of what you applied to your surface, but also of what you cultivated from within, is a distinctly different model of appearance than the one that dominated the topical approaches we've discussed all evening. It suggests a more holistic understanding of the relationship between the body's interior and its exterior, between what you put in and what shows up on the outside, and that understanding, interestingly, is considerably more aligned with modern dermatological thinking, which increasingly emphasizes nutrition, gut health, and systemic inflammation as drivers of skin appearance than the purely topical tradition that it coexisted with. The women drinking Hungary water did not have the right mechanism, but they had in some fundamental sense the right instinct. The story of beauty from the inside out is in many ways the most human chapter in this entire history, because swallowing something, taking it past your lips, past your throat into your body's most private interior, is a more intimate act of faith than anything applied to the surface. It requires a deeper conviction that this will work, a more complete surrender to the hope that beauty can be cultivated from within, that it is not merely painted on but grown, nourished, earned through what you consume and how you care for the body from the inside. That hope has never gone away. It shows up today in collagen supplements and hyaluronic acid drinks and vitamin serums and the billion-dollar industry of beauty nutrition that lines the walls of health food stores. The packaging is different. The science behind some of it is considerably more rigorous. But the hope that you can eat and drink your way to beauty from within is the same hope that the Victorian woman carried in her box of arsenic wafers, that the Styrian farm wife carried in her small daily dose of white powder, that the queen swallowed in her Hungary water, in the candlelit privacy of her chamber. Humans have always wanted to be beautiful from the inside out. We have just found different ways to try. We have now moved through faces, hair, scent, eyes, bodies, teeth, nighttime rituals, and the remarkable things women put inside themselves in pursuit of beauty's promise. And through all of it, one element has been present, but not yet fully examined. The substance that made so many of these rituals possible. The ingredient that appears in the nighttime preparations and the daytime cosmetics and the scented waters and the ceremonial treatments across every culture we've visited. The thing that connects Cleopatra to Catherine de' Medici, to the women of Grasse to the Queen, on her military campaign applying almond oil before sleep. Perfume. Not the scent management we discussed in Part 3, the practical art of odour masking in a world without running water. But perfume as something else entirely, as art, as weapon, as the most intimate form of beauty that exists, because unlike every other cosmetic practice we've discussed, it cannot be seen. It can only be felt. And the story of how it was made, how it was worn, and how it was used across history as seduction, as status, as poison, as love, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of women and beauty. That is exactly where we go next. Of all the beauty rituals we have explored tonight, perfume is the one that leaves no visible trace. You cannot see it in a portrait. You cannot find it in an excavated jar. You cannot hold it up to the light and examine what it is made of the way you can examine a lead-based foundation or a carved ivory pomander. It existed in the air around a woman's body in the warmth of her skin, in the moment of her presence, and then when she left the room it lingered for a little while and then was gone. And yet perfume may be the most powerful beauty tool in this entire history. Because while lead powder changed how a woman looked and kohl changed how her eyes appeared, and the corset changed the shape of her body, perfume changed how people felt in her presence. It reached something older and deeper than vision, something that bypassed the thinking mind and went straight to the part of the brain that processes emotion and memory and desire. The ancient Egyptians understood this. They understood it so thoroughly that they built an entire theology around it, Egypt roughly 3,500 years before the Common Era. The word that ancient Egyptians used for perfume was senature, which translates with a directness that stops you cold as to make divine, not to smell pleasant, not to be fragrant, to make divine, to transform the ordinary into the sacred through scent. This was not metaphor, it was literal theology. Egyptian temples maintained dedicated perfume laboratories, some of the oldest known examples of which have been excavated at the temples of Edfu and Philae, where the walls are inscribed with detailed recipes for sacred perfumes used in religious rituals. These were not cosmetic preparations, they were theological instruments. The smoke of burning incense carried prayers upward to the gods. The scent of sacred oils anointed the bodies of the dead for their journey into the afterlife. The fragrance that hung in the sanctuary of a temple was understood to be the literal breath of the divine made perceptible to human senses. And the women who wore perfume in ancient Egypt, the noble women, the priestesses, the queens, were not merely making themselves pleasant to be near. They were participating in a practice that connected the mortal to the immortal, the human to the divine. To wear perfume well was to carry something sacred on your skin. The most documented form of Egyptian perfume application involved what modern Egyptologists call perfume cones, depicted repeatedly in tomb paintings and relief carvings, particularly from the New Kingdom period, roughly 1500 to 1100 before the Common Era. These were cone-shaped objects made of a fat or wax base, heavily saturated with fragrant resins and oils, which were placed on top of the head, typically on top of a wig at the beginning of a banquet or ceremony, As the evening progressed and the heat of the room and the warmth of the body gradually melted the cone, the perfumed fat ran slowly down through the hair, down the neck onto the shoulders and chest, releasing its fragrance continuously throughout the evening in a slow, gradual unfurling that modern perfumers would recognize as a remarkably sophisticated delivery mechanism. You arrived at the banquet freshly anointed. As the hours passed, the fragrance deepened and changed as the wax melted and the resins released at different temperatures. By the end of the evening, you were saturated with it. Your hair, your skin, your clothing, all carrying the same warm, resinous, complex scent. The ingredients in these cones were extraordinary. Myrrh resin of the comifera tree still used in perfumery today. Frankincense boswellia resin collected from trees that grew in Somalia and southern Arabia and were traded across the ancient world at prices that made them among the most valuable commodities in the known world. Kaifi, a specific sacred Egyptian perfume blend documented in multiple ancient sources, containing a minimum of 10 and sometimes 16 or more ingredients, including honey wine raisins, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, juniper berries, and various aromatic resins that were soaked together for days before being dried into a solid form. The Greek physician Plutarch, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, documented the recipe for Kaifi with evident admiration, noting that it was used both as an incense burned in temples at sundown and as a medicinal preparation taken internally for respiratory conditions. The priest-physicians of ancient Egypt appear to have used it therapeutically, ceremonially, and cosmetically, making no sharp distinction between these categories, because in their worldview, such distinctions did not exist. Health, beauty, and holiness were not separate domains. They were the same domain approach from different angles. Now let us travel to a different ancient world, to the Rome of the 1st century of the Common Era, and to a figure whose relationship with perfume was so extraordinary that it was documented by multiple contemporary sources and has been debated by historians ever since. Cleopatra, the 7th of Egypt, not the Cleopatra of the perfume cone, she lived roughly 14 centuries later, arrived at the Roman harbour of Tarsus in 41 before the Common Era to meet Mark Antony for the first time. The historian Plutarch, writing about a century and a half after the event, described the scene with a specificity that suggests he was drawing on detailed contemporaneous sources. Her barge, Plutarch tells us, had purple sails. Its silver oars moved in time with the music of flutes and pipes, and the barge itself was saturated with perfume. The sails had been soaked in it, so that as the vessel moved across the water, the scent preceded it, reaching the shore, and the crowds gathered there before the barge itself came into view. She arrived, in other words, on a wave of fragrance. The first thing anyone experienced of Cleopatra's presence was her scent. This was not accident. This was strategy of the highest order executed by a woman who was also a linguist, fluent in 9 languages, a mathematician, a student of philosophy, and one of the most politically acute rulers of the ancient Mediterranean world. Cleopatra understood with a precision that speaks to a genuine intellectual grasp of human psychology that scent is processed by the brain differently from every other sense. Visual information travels to the thalamus before reaching the cortex. It is analyzed and categorized before it produces an emotional response. But olfactory information, smell, travels directly to the limbic system, the most ancient part of the brain, the part that governs emotion, memory, and instinctive response. It bypasses analysis entirely. It produces its effect before the thinking mind has had any opportunity to filter it. Cleopatra's perfumed sails were not decoration. They were a neurological assault delivered before she was even visible. By the time Mark Antony saw her, he had already been in her presence in the most intimate neurological sense for several minutes. Whether Plutarch's account is fully accurate in every detail is a question that historians cannot resolve. but the underlying strategy using scent as an instrument of power and influence, rather than merely as personal adornment, was entirely consistent with what we know of Cleopatra's character and methods. She used every tool available to her, and perfume used well was a remarkably powerful one. Let us move forward by roughly 16 centuries to a place we have visited before in a different context, the court of France in the 16th century. We met Catherine de' Medici earlier in this story as a patron of her perfumer René the Florentine, and as a woman who maintained her own private cosmetics laboratory. But the full story of Catherine and perfume is considerably richer than what we've already covered, and it connects to one of the most extraordinary and most debated episodes in the history of scent. Catherine arrived in France from Florence in 1533, aged 14, to marry the future King Henry II. She brought with her, along with her Florentine servants, and her considerable political intelligence, an understanding of perfumery that was considerably more sophisticated than what existed at the French court at that time. Florence in the early 16th century was alongside Venice the centre of European perfumery. The Medici family, Catherine's own family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in Europe, had been patrons of perfumers, apothecaries and alchemists for generations. Catherine had grown up around the smell of distillation, around the careful blending of resins and florals and animal fixatives, around the understanding that scent was not merely pleasant, but chemically complex and physiologically active. Her perfumer, René the Florentine, who established his shop on the Pont au Change in Paris, after accompanying Catherine to France, became the most sought-after perfumer in the city within years of his arrival. And the scented gloves he produced, which we touched on in Part 3, occupied a place in the history of perfume that goes considerably beyond their role as accessories. The specific allegation against René that he had developed a technique for impregnating gloves with poison, alongside perfume so that the wearer would absorb a fatal substance through the skin, over time cannot be confirmed or denied from the historical record. What can be confirmed is the line between perfumer and poisoner in 16th century France was genuinely blurry and not merely in rumour. Perfumers and apothecaries worked with many of the same ingredients. The plant extracts, the animal-derived fixatives, the alkaloid compounds present in certain botanicals, these existed on a spectrum between fragrant and toxic that was not always clear even to the people handling them. A skilled perfumer of the period had access to knowledge about which plants produced which effects on the body, because that knowledge was necessary to work safely with these plants. Catherine de' Medici's court was a place where perfume and pharmacy and politics were genuinely intertwined. Whether she weaponized that intersection as dramatically as her enemies claimed is uncertain. That she understood its possibilities the way that scent moves through the boundary of the skin, the way it enters the body through the lungs with every breath, the way it produces physiological effects as well as psychological ones. This seems entirely consistent with what we know of her intelligence and her appetite for every available instrument of influence. Do you ever find yourself in a place that has a very specific smell and feel yourself suddenly and completely transported to somewhere else entirely? A moment from years ago, a person you have not thought about in a long time, a feeling you forgot you ever had. That experience which most people have had at some point and which feels almost magical when it happens, is called olfactory evoked autobiographical memory, and it is among the most studied and most fascinating phenomena in cognitive neuroscience. The psychologist Rachel Hertz at Brown University, one of the leading researchers in the field of olfaction and emotion, has documented extensively that smell-triggered memories are not only more vivid than memories triggered by other senses but more emotionally intense. When a scent triggers a memory, the emotional content of that memory is retrieved with an immediacy and a force that visual or auditory triggers simply do not produce to the same degree. And the women across history who made perfume central to their beauty practice were, without knowing any of this, exploiting exactly this phenomenon. Because if a man encountered a woman wearing a particular perfume, and that encounter was pleasant, was exciting, was tender, was memorable, in any positive sense, then every subsequent encounter with that same fragrance would carry the neural echo of the first. The perfume became inseparable from the memory of the woman. The smell and the person fused in the limbic system, in the oldest and most primal part of the human brain, in a way that nothing visible could quite replicate. This is not seduction as calculation. It is seduction as neuroscience. And the women who chose their perfumes carefully, who wore the same scent consistently so that it became their olfactory signature, who understood intuitively that the right fragrance worn at the right moment could imprint itself on a person's memory more durably than any physical feature. These women were working with the most sophisticated psychological tool available to them. The city of Grasse in the south of France, which we visited briefly in part 3, in the context of the supply chain for raw perfume materials, deserves its own moment here, because what happened in Grasse between the 17th and 19th centuries is one of the most remarkable stories of craft knowledge and feminine labour in European history. By the 17th century, Grasse had established itself as the perfume capital of the Western world, not through any single invention or discovery, but through the accumulation of specialised knowledge across generations of families who did nothing else. The primary technique developed and refined in Grasse was called enfleurage, a method for capturing the fragrance of flowers so delicate that heat would destroy them before any useful amount of essential oil could be extracted. The process worked like this. Large glass plates were coated with a layer of odourless fat, typically a mixture of lard and tallow, carefully prepared to be as neutral as possible. Fresh flowers, jasmine blossoms most critically, but also tuberose violet, and others were laid face down on the fat surface in a single layer. The fat over the following hours absorbed the fragrance molecules released by the flowers. The spent blooms were replaced with fresh ones. This was repeated sometimes daily for weeks until the fat was completely saturated with fragrance. The fat was then dissolved in alcohol, which extracted the fragrance compounds from the fat, and the alcohol was then evaporated, leaving behind the absolute a concentrated fragrant extract of extraordinary intensity and fidelity. The jasmine absolute produced by Grasse enfleurage was and remains one of the most prized ingredients in fine perfumery. A single pound of jasmine absolute requires roughly 3 million individual jasmine flowers, each picked by hand, in the early morning hours before the heat of the day begins to destroy their fragrance. Chanel No. 5, perhaps the most famous perfume in the world, created in 1921, used Grasse jasmine as one of its central ingredients, a use that continues at reduced scale to this day. The women who picked those jasmine flowers, the cueilleuses of Grasse, rising before dawn to move through the fields in the early morning light, their baskets filling with blossoms that would be delivered to the perfumers' workshops before the sun was fully up, were essential to the entire enterprise. The jasmine flower has a peak fragrance window of roughly 2 to 3 hours in the early morning. Miss that window and the flower gives you something, but not the extraordinary thing that Grasse jasmine at its best could give you. The knowledge of when to pick, how to handle the flowers without bruising them, how to transport them to the workshop without allowing them to begin deteriorating. This knowledge lived in the hands and the sensory memory of the women who did this work. It was skilled labour. It was essential labour. And it was for most of Grasse's history almost entirely invisible in the historical record because it was women's labour, and therefore not the kind of thing that tended to get written down. By the 19th century, the development of synthetic fragrance compounds began to transform perfumery in ways that are still being felt today. The first fully synthetic perfume ingredient, coumarin, a compound with a warm, sweet hay-like fragrance, was synthesized by the British chemist William Henry Perkin in 1868. It was followed rapidly by vanillin in 1874, heliotropin in 1880, and a cascade of synthetic molecules that for the first time gave perfumers access to scents that did not exist in nature. What synthetic chemistry brought to perfumery was not the replacement of natural ingredients. The finest perfumes continued to use both, but the democratization of fragrance. Perfumes that had previously required extraordinarily expensive natural materials could now be produced at a fraction of the cost using synthetic equivalents. The perfumes that had been accessible only to queens and noblewomen in the 16th and 17th centuries became, by the early 20th century, accessible to a considerably broader population. And with that democratization came something interesting, the idea that perfume was not merely the privilege of the powerful, but a form of self-expression available to any woman who could afford a small bottle and a private moment in front of a mirror. The theology of the ancient Egyptians, the idea that wearing fragrance was a way of participating in something sacred, something that transcended the ordinary, had travelled across 3,500 years into the vanity table of an ordinary woman in an ordinary house in 1920s, Paris, who uncapped her small bottle and touched her wrist to the glass stopper and carried in the warmth of her skin something that connected her to every woman across every century who had ever done exactly the same thing. Of all the beauty rituals in this history, perfume is the one that asks the least of the body and gives the most to the spirit. It does not require pain, it does not deform or compress or poison. It simply asks that you choose a fragrance that feels in some way like you or like the you that you want to be tonight and carry it out into the world. And in return it gives you something that no foundation or corset or coal or arsenic wafer could ever quite provide, an invisible presence that extends beyond the edges of your body, that enters a room before you arrive and lingers after you leave, that exists in the memories of the people who encounter you as something irreducibly, unforgettably personal. Cleopatra knew this. Catherine de' Medici knew it. The women of grass-picking jasmine in the early morning light knew it in a different but equally real way. Perfume at its best is the closest thing the history of beauty has ever come to genuine magic. We have now travelled through nearly the entire landscape of historical beauty, the face, the hair, the scent, the eyes, the body, the nighttime rituals, the things swallowed and the fragrances worn. We have visited ancient Egypt and Renaissance Italy, and the Pacific Islands and the mountain villages of Austria. And through all of it we've been moving toward the question that sits underneath every single story we have told tonight. The question that the white face and the black teeth and the perfumed sails and the raw beef mask are all in their own way attempts to answer. What does it mean to be a woman in a world that watches you? What does beauty cost? And what does it give you in return? That is the conversation waiting for us next. The one where all the pieces of tonight's story come together into something larger and more revealing than any single ritual could show us alone. What we've been building tonight, piece by piece, story by story, is a portrait. Not the portrait of any single woman, but something larger and more complicated than that. A portrait of what it has meant across 2,000 years of human civilization to be a woman who is watched, who is evaluated, who moves through the world knowing that her appearance carries meaning, social meaning, moral meaning, economic meaning that she did not choose and cannot entirely escape. We have seen what women spread on their faces and swallowed into their bodies and built on top of their heads. We have watched them compress their rib cages and blacken their teeth, and plant jasmine fields at dawn, and sit upright in chairs all night to protect hairstyles too tall to lay down safely. And we've asked at each stop along the way the same underlying question, why, but we have not yet asked the harder version of that question. Not just why did individual women do these things, But why did entire civilizations across centuries and continents and radically different cultural contexts consistently produce beauty standards that required women, specifically women, and not men to anything like the same degree to go to these lengths? What is the structure underneath all of these specific rituals that explains their presence in virtually every human society that has ever existed? That is the question this part of our journey is for. Let us begin with a woman named Hannah Culwick. Hannah Culwick was born in Shropshire, England in 1833, the daughter of a saddler. She began working as a domestic servant at the age of 8 and spent most of her adult life in service in various London households, scrubbing floors, blacking grates, hauling coal, washing laundry. Physical, relentless, largely invisible labour of the kind that kept Victorian middle-class households functioning, while the women of those households maintained their pale hands and their fashionable appearances and their reputation for refined leisure. Hannah was in the Victorian class system about as far from the beauty rituals of the women we've been discussing tonight as it was possible to be. She had no lead foundation, no corset of any quality, no pomander, no time for elaborate nighttime preparations. Her hands were permanently roughened and darkened by the work she did. Her face was weathered. She smelled of whatever she'd been cleaning most recently. And yet Hannah Culwick left behind something extraordinary, a series of diaries written at the request of a man she was secretly involved with for decades, the barrister and poet Arthur Munby, that documented her daily life in remarkable detail. These diaries, now held at Trinity College in Cambridge, are one of the most vivid accounts of working-class Victorian women's experience that survives from the period. What Hannah wrote again and again, with the directness and an intelligence that is genuinely striking, was about the relationship between her appearance and her place in the world, about what it meant that the women she worked for could be beautiful, smooth-handed, pale, corseted, scented, while she could not, about the way that beauty in her world was not a personal achievement but a class marker, a sign of which category of woman you were, a signal legible to everyone who saw you of where you stood in the social order. "My hands show what I am," she wrote in her diary in 1864. Not with bitterness exactly, with a clarity that is almost more difficult to read than bitterness would be. Hannah Culwick understood with the precision that comes from living at the bottom of a system exactly what beauty was and exactly what it was for. It was a credential, a class document worn on the body. This understanding that beauty standards function as social sorting mechanisms separating the women who have the resources, the time, and the social position to meet them from the women who do not, is not a modern feminist insight. It is as old as the standards themselves. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, observed with his characteristic acid wit that a wealthy woman's beauty was maintained by an army of servants, that what appeared to be the natural grace and radiance of a high-born Roman lady was in fact the collective labour of the women who dressed her hair, mixed her cosmetics, applied her ceruse, and managed the elaborate machinery of her appearance every single morning. The beauty was real, Juvenal noted, but it was not hers alone. It was produced. What Juvenal was describing with contempt aimed in his usual fashion in several directions at once was the fundamental economic structure of historical beauty. To be beautiful in most eras and most cultures required resources. It required money to purchase ingredients, servants to apply them, time to submit to lengthy rituals, and freedom from the kind of physical labour that permanently marks the body with evidence of work. The woman who could be beautiful was almost by definition the woman who did not have to work with her hands, and the woman who could not be beautiful whose hands were rough, whose face was weathered, whose time and money did not permit the rituals was visibly marked as belonging to a different category. Beauty was not merely attractive, it was a certificate of membership in a particular class. But here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated and genuinely interesting, because that analysis, while accurate, is not the complete picture. Because if beauty were purely and only a class marker, purely a mechanism of social sorting imposed from above, we would expect to find women across history chafing against it, resisting it, accepting it reluctantly as an external imposition on their authentic selves. And we do find some of that. The rational dress reformers of the Victorian era genuinely resisted the corset on exactly those grounds. Early feminist writers in the 18th and 19th centuries questioned the social pressure on women to invest enormous time and resources in their appearance when men faced no comparable demand. But we also find, and this is the part that complicates the simple narrative, enormous numbers of women across history who found genuine meaning, genuine pleasure, genuine self-expression, and genuine power in their beauty rituals, who were not victims of the system but active participants in it, deriving real satisfaction from its mastery. The sociologist Irving Goffman, in his 1959 work, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, argued that all social interaction involves a kind of performance, that we all manage our appearance and behavior to project a particular version of ourselves to the people around us. Beauty rituals in this framework are not something imposed on women from outside. They are one of the primary theatres in which women have always performed identity, have always told the story of who they are and who they choose to be. And the performance for many women was not experienced as oppression. It was experienced as craft. Think about the women we have met tonight in this light. The Egyptian noblewoman applying her kohl in the morning was not merely submitting to a beauty standard. She was participating in a practice that connected her to the divine, that protected her eyes from a genuinely dangerous environment that aligned her visually with the powerful imagery of the Eye of Horus. The ritual had meaning that went far beyond vanity. The Heian court lady blackening her teeth was not merely following a fashion. She was performing a version of womanhood that was saturated with literary and spiritual meaning, a version that placed her within a tradition of cultivated femininity that she had been educated to admire and aspire to. The black teeth were not the price of belonging. They were the symbol of belonging. The Victorian woman tight-lacing her corset was, as we discussed, sometimes genuinely choosing it, finding in the physical sensation of the corset a form of bodily self-definition, a way of inhabiting her body with a particular intention and discipline that felt from the inside like self-expression rather than constraint. And the woman in the Pacific Island grinding turmeric into coconut oil before a ceremony was connecting herself to her ancestors, to her island, to a chain of women stretching back through generations who had performed exactly this same act at exactly this same kind of moment. The beauty ritual was a thread in the fabric of cultural continuity. These meanings were real. They were not false consciousness imposed by a patriarchal structure. They were genuine human experiences of genuine human women. The honest account of beauty across history holds both things simultaneously. The system was in important structural ways designed to benefit those at the top of social hierarchies by creating standards that were expensive to meet, and that sorted women accordingly. And within that system, individual women found genuine agency, genuine pleasure, and genuine meaning. Both are true. And the discomfort of holding both things true at the same time is, I think, exactly the right response to the complexity of the history. There is a woman I want to tell you about who embodies this complexity more fully than almost anyone else in this entire story. Her name was Lola Montez, born Eliza Rosanna Gilbert in County Sligo, Ireland. In 1821, she reinvented herself in her 20s as a Spanish dancer named Lola Montez, a fiction she maintained with such conviction that it took years for her true origins to become widely known. She performed across Europe, created scandal in virtually every city she visited, and became, for a remarkable few years in the 1840s, one of the most famous and talked about women on the continent. But what makes Lola Montez relevant to this particular chapter of our story is something she did after her performing career ended. In 1858, living in the United States after years of European notoriety, she published a book called The Arts of Beauty or Secrets of a Lady's Toilet. It is an extraordinary document, part beauty manual, part memoir, part social commentary. The book contains Lola Montez's own preparations for skincare, hair care, and general physical maintenance, some of which are practical and sensible, some of which are entertainingly alarming, and all of which are delivered in a voice of complete and unapologetic confidence. But what makes the book genuinely remarkable is not its beauty advice, it is its argument. Lola Montez argued in 1858, before the women's suffrage movement had fully crystallized, that a woman's investment in her beauty was not vanity. It was intelligence. It was the rational management of one of the few resources available to her in a world that had closed most other avenues of influence. She wrote with a directness bordering on provocation that a woman who neglected her appearance in the name of some higher principle was not being admirable. She was being strategic in a way that served no one, least of all herself. She also argued something more subtle and more interesting, that genuine beauty was not the product of cosmetics but of character, that a woman who was genuinely curious, genuinely alive, genuinely engaged with the world around her would always be more beautiful than a woman who had perfect features and a dead behind the eyes. That the rituals of beauty, the rose water, the careful skin care, the thoughtful attention to one's own appearance, were practices that trained a woman's attention toward herself, toward the value of her own body and her own presence in a culture that was otherwise determined to tell her she did not matter. This is, I think, a remarkable argument to have made in 1858. And it is one that resonates in ways Lola Montez could not have fully anticipated, because here is what the entire history of women's beauty rituals taken together suggests about something much larger. In virtually every society we've examined tonight, from ancient Egypt to Heian Japan to Victorian England to the Pacific Islands, women's beauty rituals served as one of the primary spaces in which women could exercise something that the broader culture was systematically withholding from them: control. In a world where women could not vote, could not own property, could not determine who they married or where they lived or how they spent their days, the body was one of the few domains where a woman's choices were to some meaningful extent her own. The white face, the black teeth, the pomander, the enfleurage jasmine, these were choices made in a space of limited but genuine autonomy. The historian Kathy Peace, in her landmark 1998 study, Hope in a Jar, The Making of America's Beauty Culture, traced the history of the American cosmetics industry from its origins in the late 19th century through the early 20th, and found something surprising: the women who were earliest and most enthusiastic adopters of commercially available cosmetics in the United States were not wealthy women. They were working-class women, immigrant women, African American women, women with the fewest resources and the fewest social privileges. These were not women who needed cosmetics to enter fashionable society. They were women who used cosmetics as a form of self-definition in a world that was determined to define them entirely by their labor, their poverty, or their race. The lipstick, the powder, the rouge, these were not luxury items. They were acts of insistence. I am more than what you see. I choose how I present myself. I exist as a person with aesthetic preferences and a sense of my own beauty that your assessment of me does not determine. Pace called this the democracy of beauty, the idea that cosmetics, as they became mass-produced and widely available, gave women across class lines access to a form of self-presentation that had previously been the exclusive province of the wealthy. And for many women, that access was experienced as genuinely liberating. Not because it freed them from the beauty standard, but because it gave them the tools to meet it on their own terms rather than being entirely excluded from it. I want to ask you something now, and I want you to think about it honestly. When you get dressed in the morning, when you choose what to wear, how to arrange your hair, whether to put on makeup or not, what scent to use or not use, are you doing it for other people or for yourself? Or is that question even answerable in any simple way? Because I think most honest people, when they sit with that question, find that the answer is both in proportions that shift depending on the day and the context and the specific ritual in question. We are social creatures. We exist in relationship to other people. The way we present ourselves is never entirely private, never entirely divorced from the gaze of the world we move through, but it is also never entirely public, never entirely reducible to performance for an audience. There is always something in the morning ritual that is just for you, just the satisfaction of choosing, of composing, of presenting a version of yourself that feels like you. The women of Versailles, and the women of Heian, Japan, and the women of Victorian London all understood this duality. They lived inside it, navigating it with varying degrees of awareness and varying degrees of success, in a world that was far less forgiving of the individual negotiation than ours is. Their specific rituals belong to their specific worlds. The human experience underneath those rituals belongs to all of us. We're nearly at the end of tonight's journey, but not quite. Because there is one more conversation waiting for us, the most personal one, the one that asks not what women did, but what it all adds up to. What the white faces and the black teeth and the perfumed sails and the satin corsets and the jasmine fields at dawn are collectively saying about something essential in the human story. And there is a woman I want you to meet before we get there. A woman whose story I think holds the whole of tonight's history in a single life. A woman who navigated beauty and power and identity and loss in a way that brings everything we have discussed into a focus so sharp it almost hurts. Her story, and the final question it asks, is waiting right ahead. Her name was Georgiana, and if you had been alive in London in the 1780s, you would have known exactly who that meant without needing a surname. In a city of nearly 1 million people, in a country where the names of the famous were passed around in drawing rooms and coffee houses, and printed in the scandal sheets that Londoners devoured with their morning tea, there was only one Georgiana whose first name alone was sufficient. Georgiana Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire, born in 1757 into one of the most prominent aristocratic families in England, married at 17 to one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country, she became almost immediately and almost involuntarily the most watched woman in Britain. Her clothes were reported on, her hairstyles, and she wore them tall in the fashion of her era, though with more genuine flair than most, were copied by women across the country within weeks of their first appearance. Her opinions on politics were sought and given weight that women of her era were not supposed to have. Her face appeared on shop signs, on printed fabrics, on commemorative ceramics, on the political cartoons of James Gilray, those savage, brilliant, unflattering engravings that functioned as the social media of the 18th century. She was famous in the way that very few people in history have been famous not for a specific achievement, but for the sheer force of her presence, her personality, her beauty, and the particular quality of aliveness that seemed to radiate from her wherever she went. And she was for most of her adult life utterly miserable in ways that her public face was constructed with considerable skill and considerable cost to conceal. Georgiana's story is not one we have told tonight in any of its specific details, but it contains in compressed form almost every theme we've explored across this entire journey. The beauty standard she was expected to meet was extraordinary, As Duchess of Devonshire, she was required to appear at court at public events at the endless social machinery of the London season, in a state of visible perfection that left almost no margin for error. Her face, her figure, her dress, her hair, her manner, her bearing. All of it was subject to public scrutiny, at a level that we might, without too much exaggeration, compare to the most aggressive forms of celebrity culture today. She managed this scrutiny with a professionalism that her biographer Amanda Foreman, in her 1998 work, Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, documented in meticulous detail. The daily routine of preparation required to present herself publicly was lengthy, elaborate, and managed with the assistance of several ladies' maids. Her dresses, and she spent prodigious sums on them, contributing significantly to debts that would shadow her for most of her life, were commissioned from the finest dressmakers in London and Paris. Her face was powdered, her cheeks rouged, her eyes carefully attended to. She was performing every single day the most demanding version of the beauty rituals of her era, and the performance was so successful that most people who encountered her appear to have experienced her as effortlessly naturally beautiful and graceful, which is of course precisely the effect that consummate performance achieves. But underneath the performance was a woman dealing with a husband who was cold, unfaithful, and largely indifferent to her emotional life, with a ménage à trois that she did not choose but was powerless to refuse when the Duke installed his mistress, Lady Elizabeth Foster, into their household, and Georgiana over years watched helplessly as the woman who had been her closest friend became the person most intimate with her husband, with gambling debts so severe that she spent years terrified of their discovery, borrowing from friends, from moneylenders, from anyone who might help her conceal the scale of the problem from the Duke. With a pregnancy in 1791 that she was forced to spend abroad concealed because the child was not her husband's, a child she was not permitted to raise, and whose existence she had to keep secret for years. And through all of it, through the debts and the heartbreak and the secret pregnancy and the loneliness of a marriage that was a legal and social arrangement rather than anything resembling genuine companionship, she got dressed every morning. She sat at her dressing table. She submitted to the ritual. She went out into the world looking exactly as a Duchess of Devonshire was supposed to look, because the alternative to appear publicly diminished, visibly struggling, obviously vulnerable, was in her world not merely unfashionable, it was socially fatal. The appearance of composure was not separate from the reality of her power. It was the last form of power she had reliable access to. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it is the most important thing in Georgiana's story. She was an extraordinarily intelligent woman. Her political involvement with the Whig Party, her personal friendship with Charles James Fox, her campaign work during the Westminster election of 1784, in which she canvassed personally for votes in a way that was considered scandalous and extraordinary for a woman of her class, all of this speaks to a mind that was genuinely exceptional and genuinely frustrated by the limits of what her world permitted. She wrote poetry. She composed music. She wrote a novel published anonymously in 1791 called The Sylph, which dealt with the experience of a young woman navigating the social world of London, a world Georgiana knew from the inside with absolute precision. She corresponded with scientists, with philosophers, with the leading intellectual figures of her era, and yet all of that, the intelligence, the political acumen, the literary ability, the genuine intellectual life, was consistently treated as secondary, as ornamental, as the charming extras of a woman whose primary social function was to be beautiful, to be decorative, and to reflect credit on the Duke of Devonshire by being the most admired woman in whatever room she entered. Her beauty was not her most interesting quality, but it was in the eyes of her world her most important one. There is something in that, Something about a mind of that caliber being required to invest so much of its energy in the maintenance of an appearance, the management of a public face, the daily performance of a standard that existed entirely apart from anything she actually thought or felt or wanted, that I find genuinely heartbreaking, even across 250 years. Georgiana developed in her 40s a severe eye infection, probably erysipelas, a bacterial infection of the skin around the eye, that left her significantly disfigured on one side of her face. She lost the sight in her right eye and suffered permanent damage to the tissue around it. The portraits painted after this point, the few that exist, because she largely withdrew from the kind of public portraiture that had defined her earlier life, show a face turned carefully to present the undamaged side to the viewer. She died in 1806 at the age of 48. The obituaries and memorials were extensive and genuinely moving, and they were overwhelmingly focused on her beauty, her style, her social grace, on the qualities of her public face, rather than the qualities of her mind or her character, or the remarkable private resilience that had carried her through decades of genuine suffering. Which is, if you stop to think about it, its own kind of comment on everything we have discussed tonight. Georgiana's story is extreme in its particulars, but not unusual in its structure. It is the same structure we have encountered in different forms in essentially every life we've looked at across this journey. A woman of considerable gifts and considerable intelligence navigating a world that evaluated her primarily on her appearance, finding within the rituals of beauty the clothing, the hair, the cosmetics, the careful daily performance of femininity, a form of agency, a form of expression, and sometimes a form of survival, paying a real price for the standard, finding real meaning within it, being diminished by it and empowered by it simultaneously. This is not Georgiana's specific tragedy. It is the human condition of women across history played out at different scales in different costumes across every era and every culture we have visited tonight. Let me tell you about one more woman before we close this part of the story, a woman who represents, I think, a kind of turning point. A moment when the long history of women and beauty began to shift in a direction that none of the women we have met tonight could quite have imagined. Her name was Sarah Breedlove, and she was born in Delta, Louisiana in 1867, the daughter of formerly enslaved parents. She was orphaned at 7, married at 14, widowed at 20, and left to raise a daughter alone with almost no resources and almost no prospects. By 1916, she was the first self-made female millionaire in American history. She built that fortune through hair care, specifically through a line of products she developed for African American women, a community that the established cosmetics industry of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had either ignored entirely or served with products that were in their underlying assumptions designed to make black women look more like white women. Lighter skin, straighter hair features brought closer to the European standard that dominated American beauty culture. Sarah Breedlove, who became known as Madam C.J. Walker, taking the name of her third husband, rejected that framework from the beginning. Her products were not about transformation toward a white beauty standard. They were about the health, strength, and beauty of the hair that African American women actually had. Her wonderful hair grower, her glossine pressing oil, her system of scalp care, these were designed to address the specific conditions and needs of her customers' hair, not to make it into something else. And she sold them through a business model that was for its time extraordinarily innovative, a network of agents, African American women who were trained by Madam Walker and her company, who ran their own businesses, who earned their own independent income selling and demonstrating her products in their communities. By 1910, Madam Walker employed more than 5,000 agents across the United States, Central America, and the Caribbean. She built a factory in Indianapolis, a hair salon in Harlem, a magnificent estate called Villa Lewaro on the Hudson River that she designed and built specifically to be a visible, undeniable statement of what an African American woman could achieve in a country that was working very hard to limit what African American people could be. She became a philanthropist, a political activist, a vocal opponent of racial violence, a donor to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She used the wealth she had built through beauty to fund causes that went far beyond beauty. She died in 1919 at the age of 51, one of the wealthiest self-made women in American history, having built an empire from a specific and radical act of attention. She saw a community of women who were being told that their natural appearance was a problem to be corrected, and she said, "No. Your hair, your skin, your face are not problems. They are the beginning. Let us start from there." What makes Madame Walker's story so powerful in the context of everything we've discussed tonight is that she took the same raw material women's desire to care for and enhance their appearance, women's investment in the rituals of beauty, and turned it into something that the women we have been discussing across centuries and continents never quite had access to: economic independence, community, political agency, self-definition. The beauty rituals we have explored tonight were, in most of the cases we examined, practiced within systems designed by and for the benefit of people other than the women performing them. The white-lead foundation served a beauty standard that upheld class hierarchies that benefited men at the top. The corset served a silhouette ideal that constrained women's physical freedom. The arsenic wafers were sold by male-owned pharmaceutical companies to female customers whose well-being was clearly not the primary concern. Madame Walker took the same human impulse, the desire of women to feel beautiful, to care for their appearance, to participate in the rituals of self-presentation, and built from it something that returned the benefit to the women themselves. She made beauty a source of women's economic power rather than a drain on it. She made it a vehicle for community rather than a mechanism of class exclusion. She made it a foundation for political action rather than a distraction from it. This was not a small thing. It was, in the context of the entire long history we have travelled through tonight, a genuinely radical act. Do you ever think about why the beauty industry, the global cosmetics industry that today generates revenues of over $500 billion annually, is built so overwhelmingly on selling to women? The answer that the industry itself usually gives is demand. Women want these products, women buy these products, therefore the industry serves women. And that is true as far as it goes. But the history we have walked through tonight suggests a more complicated answer. Women have wanted and bought beauty products across every era of recorded history, in part because beauty has always carried stakes for women that it has not carried to the same degree for men. The appearance of a woman has been evaluated, scrutinized, and used as a basis for social, economic, and political judgment, in ways that men's appearances simply have not been with anything like the same consistency and intensity. The beauty industry did not create women's investment in their appearance. It inherited it from thousands of years of social structure that had already established that investment as rational, as necessary as survival. What the industry has done at its best in the tradition of Madame Walker is give women better and safer tools for an investment they were already making, and at its worst in the tradition of the arsenic wafer manufacturer calling his product perfectly harmless. It has exploited that investment, selling fear back to the people it manufactured the fear in at a profit. Both versions of the industry exist today. They always have. We're almost at the end of our journey tonight. One more conversation ahead, the last one, the one that brings everything together. And I want to tell you before we get there that the question this entire story has been circling, the question of what beauty costs and what it gives and who it serves and who it harms, is not a question with a clean answer at the end. History does not offer those. What it offers instead is something more honest and I think more useful: the accumulated experience of women across thousands of years of navigating the same fundamental tension between the world's demands and their own desires, between the standard and the self, between the performance and the person behind it. Every woman in this story, Georgiana in her dressing room, Madame Walker in her factory, the jasmine pickers of grass, the Heian noblewoman at her mirror, the Roman woman grinding her sheep fat before bed, was working on the same problem, with different tools, in different contexts, with different degrees of freedom and different degrees of constraint. But the problem itself, underneath all the centuries and all the costumes, was always the same one. How do I exist in this world as myself? How do I use what is available to me? How do I find within the limits of what my world permits something that feels like beauty, not just by their definition, but by mine? Those questions have never stopped being asked. They are being asked right now, tonight, in bedrooms and bathrooms, and in front of mirrors in 1,000 different cities, by women who have no idea they are part of a history this long, and this rich, and this complicated. And that is exactly where we're going next, to the final chapter of tonight's story, the one that ties the thread from ancient Egypt all the way to the present, and asks what we owe, and what we keep, and what we finally get to let go. The lights are very low now. If you have made it all the way here through the lead powder and the towering hair, through the coal and the corsets and the crocodile excrement, and the jasmine fields at dawn, through Georgiana's dressing table, and Madame Walker's factory and the quiet bedroom of a Roman woman applying sheep fat to her face before sleep, then you have spent this entire evening inside one of the longest and most intimate stories in all of human history. And I want to take this last part of our journey slowly, because what we are about to do is not summarize. Summaries are for information, and what we have been doing tonight is not exchanging information. We have been doing something older than that, something that happens when stories accumulate around a single human truth until the truth becomes impossible to look away from. So let us look at it directly. Here is what I think the entire history of women's beauty rituals is actually about. Not vanity, not oppression, not the weakness of women who could not resist impossible standards, and not the heroism of women who subverted those standards, and not any of the other simplified narratives that tend to attach themselves to this history like barnacles to a hull. What it is about when you strip everything else away is the human need to matter, to be seen, to be recognized, to move through the world and have the world register your presence as meaningful, as worthy of attention, as deserving of consideration, as belonging to the category of people who count. That need is not feminine, it is not historical, it is not cultural, it is one of the most fundamental and most universal things about being human. But for most of recorded history, the pathways through which that need could be met were profoundly unequal between men and women. Men could demonstrate their worth through action, through war, through commerce, through political achievement, through the accumulation of property and the exercise of power. These were the approved currencies of male significance, the ways a man could make the world notice him. Women had far fewer currencies available, and beauty, the carefully cultivated, ritually maintained, socially legible beauty that we've been tracing through 5,000 years of human civilization, was one of the most reliable ones. This does not make the beauty rituals purely strategic. Humans are not purely strategic. People find genuine pleasure in things that also serve their interests, and the pleasure does not become less genuine because it serves a purpose. The woman who loved the smell of her rosewater rinse, who felt genuinely satisfied by the careful architecture of her hair, who experienced real delight in the luminosity that her kohl gave to her eyes, that pleasure was real. That satisfaction was real. But it existed within a structure, and the structure was not neutral. I want to tell you about a moment in history that I think of as a kind of hinge point, A moment when the long, slow story we've been tracing began visibly and publicly to bend in a new direction. It happened in 1920 in the streets of Atlantic City, New Jersey. The first Miss America pageant had just been held, a competition explicitly built around the public evaluation and ranking of women's physical appearance, which drew enormous crowds and considerable press attention, and which seemed to its organisers and many of its spectators like a perfectly natural and unremarkable thing to do. And at the same time, across the country, something else was happening. Women had just won the right to vote in the United States with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920. After decades of organising, marching, arguing, being arrested, going on hunger strikes and being force-fed in prison after one of the longest and most difficult political campaigns in American history, women had finally been legally recognised as full citizens whose political judgment was worth counting. In the same year, the same country. The Miss America pageant and the 19th Amendment, the beauty standard and the ballot arriving simultaneously. I do not think this is a coincidence. I think it is a snapshot of exactly the tension that has run through the entire history we've been exploring tonight, the tension between the world that evaluates women by how they look and the world that would evaluate them by what they think, what they do, what they choose. Both worlds existed in 1920. Both worlds exist today. The ratio has shifted substantially meaningfully in ways that the women of previous centuries would find almost unimaginably different from what they knew. But the tension itself has not been resolved. It has simply found new expressions. The global beauty industry today generates, as I mentioned, revenues in excess of $500 billion annually. That number is growing every year. The products are safer, more regulated, more scientifically sophisticated than anything the women of previous centuries had access to. The marketing is more targeted, more personalized, more psychologically precise than anything a Victorian arsenic wafer advertisement could have imagined. And the fundamental offer has not changed. You're not quite enough as you are. Here is something that will help. That offer has been made to women in one form or another for 5,000 years. The specific insufficiency changes. Now it is your pores, your pigmentation, your fine lines, your under-eye circles, your cellulite, your lashes, your brows. The remedies change. Now they come in elegant packaging with ingredient lists and clinical trial references and before and after photographs. The price point changes from a few coins for a pot of ceruse to a few $100s for a serum containing a concentration of something derived from a plant that grows on the slopes of a specific mountain range in Switzerland. But the emotional structure underneath the transaction is the same one that has always been there. The historian Naomi Wolf, in her 1991 work The Beauty Myth, argued that the intensification of beauty standards in the 20th century was not a coincidence, but a response that as women gained more political and economic power, the pressure to invest time, money and energy in their appearance increased proportionally, functioning as a kind of counterweight to keep women occupied, self-conscious, and economically dependent on industries catering to their perceived inadequacies. Wolf's argument was and remains contested. Critics pointed out that it oversimplified both the industry and women's relationship to it, that it reproduced exactly the same condescension toward women's choices that it claimed to critique, by treating women who genuinely enjoyed beauty products as dupes of a system rather than as agents with preferences of their own. Both sides of that debate, I think, have something true in them. The system is real, the pleasure is also real, and the task that women in every era have faced the task of navigating between the authentic and the performed, between the genuine and the strategic, between the pleasure that is truly yours and the fear that has been sold to you is genuinely difficult. There is no map for it. There has never been a map for it. There is only the accumulated wisdom of 5,000 years of women who tried. What does that wisdom say? Not the specific formulas, not the sheep fat or the coal or the belladonna drops or the arsenic wafers. Those belong to their specific times and should stay there. But the knowledge underneath the formulas, the knowledge that the women grinding their pigments and distilling their rosewater and building their poufs were accumulating over generations whether they could articulate it or not. It says your body is not a problem to be solved. It is a medium to be worked with. It says the rituals you perform on and for your body are never just about your body. They are about your relationship to the world, to your culture, to the women who came before you, to the version of yourself you are trying to bring into being. It says beauty is a language, and like all languages, it can be used to tell the truth or to tell lies, to include or to exclude, to liberate or to imprison. And which of those things it does depends entirely on who is speaking it and who is listening, and what the relationship of power is between them. It says the desire to feel beautiful is not shallow. It is one of the most persistent and most human desires in existence, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. And it says, perhaps most importantly, you are not the first woman to stand in front of a mirror and wonder whether what you see there is enough. You are in fact the most recent in an unbroken line of women stretching back through centuries who stood in front of whatever reflective surface their era provided polished metal, still water handheld glass, and felt exactly that same complicated mixture of hope and doubt and aspiration and self-criticism that you feel. You are connected to all of them. The Roman woman pressing sheep fat into her skin before bed. The Egyptian noblewoman watching the perfume cone melt slowly through her wig in the warm air of a banquet hall. The girl in the grass fields at 4 a.m, her basket filling with jasmine, the whole hillside smelling like something between heaven and a very specific kind of human longing. The Heian poet sitting at her mirror with her small bowl of blackening solution, her mind full of verses about the moon, over an autumn lake, her hands steady and practiced at this morning ritual she has performed 1,000 times. Georgiana at her dressing table at 7 a.m, composing her public face with the same discipline she brought to composing her private grief. Madam Walker in her factory surrounded by the smell of her hair preparations, understanding with perfect clarity that she was building something that went far beyond hair. The Victorian woman tight-lacing her corset and gripping the bedpost, and deciding in that breath before the final pull that this is the version of herself she is choosing to present today. All of them were doing what you do, what we all do, negotiating every single day the relationship between the self that lives inside and the self that walks out into the world, using whatever tools their era provided, paying whatever price their era extracted, finding whatever meaning their era made available. The tools change, the price changes, the meaning changes, the negotiation never ends. I want to close tonight with something that happened in a museum in London some years ago that I have never been able to forget. In the Victoria and Albert Museum, which houses one of the great collections of decorative arts and historical objects in the world, there is a small collection of historical cosmetics containers. Tiny pots and vials and boxes made of glass and ivory and silver and painted enamel that once held the beauty preparations of women across centuries. Some of them are genuinely beautiful objects in their own right, made with craft and care by artisans who understood that the container was part of the ritual, that the experience of opening something lovely to apply something precious was itself a meaningful act. Most of them are empty now. Whatever they once held evaporated or dried or was used to the last particle centuries ago. They are just the shells. But I stood in front of one of them for a long time, a small Roman pot about 2,000 years old that had once held some kind of cosmetic preparation. The trace residue suggested something fat-based possibly, with a mineral pigment. No one knows whose it was. No one knows her name or her age or what she looked like or what her life contained outside the moment when she reached for this small pot and took from it whatever she needed. But she was there. She existed. She had mornings and evenings and mirrors and hopes and doubts and the particular human desire to take care of herself, to prepare herself to walk out into her world with intention and with care. And 2,000 years later her small pot sat in a glass case in London, and I stood in front of it, and for just a moment the 2,000 years collapsed into nothing, and she was simply a woman, and I was simply a woman, and the distance between us was exactly the width of a piece of glass. That is what this history does when you let it in. It collapses the distance. It reminds you that the women of the past were not a different kind of creature from the women of the present. They were not simpler, not less conscious, not less complex in their inner lives. They were navigating a version of the same world with a version of the same tools that every generation inherits and modifies and passes on. They were doing their best with what they had, as are we all. And so tonight's journey ends here, not with a conclusion, because this is a story without a conclusion, but with something better than a conclusion, with the knowledge that you are part of something ancient and continuous and deeply, inescapably human, with the invitation to think about your own rituals, the morning ones and the evening ones, the quick and the elaborate, the ones you love and the ones you do out of habit, and the ones you're still figuring out, and to hold them with a little more curiosity, a little more compassion, and a little more appreciation for the extraordinary chain of women through whose hands these impulses and practices travel to reach you. You did not invent the desire to feel beautiful. You inherited it from women who are in every way that matters your kin. If tonight's story gave you something, a new thought, a moment of recognition, a detail that surprised you, a feeling you did not expect, I hope you will carry it with you into your sleep and let it become part of the way you see the world when you wake. And if you have a friend who would love to spend an evening like this one travelling through history in the quiet company of stories and questions and the occasional detail about crocodile excrement, please share this with them. It genuinely means everything to this little channel, and it is the kindest thing you can do for the kind of storytelling that we make here together. Leave a comment below if something tonight moved you. Tell me which woman's story stayed with you. Tell me which ritual surprised you most. Tell me if you looked at your own morning routine a little differently somewhere in the middle of all of this. I read every single one. And until the next story finds us, take good care of yourself. In whatever way feels most true to you. Good night.